I'm rolling.
Okay, today's date is Thursday, January the 18th, 2024. My name is Crispin Brooks. I'm interviewing Michael Seltzer on behalf of the USC Shoah Foundation. This is a hybrid interview in that I'm in Los Angeles, California, while Mr. Seltzer is in Colorado Springs, Colorado, in the United States of America. The language of this interview will be English. Thank you.
Okay,
Okay.
I am rolling. So we are good.
Please state your name.
Michael Seltzer.
And what was your name at birth?
The same.
And did you have any other names?
No.
Is there any special significance to why you were named Michael?
Yes, I was born in late 1940, and my parents were, as refugees, I suppose, concerned about the world situation. And they came up with the idea that I should have a name that could be used without any substantial change if the Soviets were to take over the world. So Michael can be Mikhail, and my middle name is Ivan, not Ian, Ivan. So I could easily pass to as Mikhail Ivan, I suppose. And that was why I was given those names.
And can you tell us your exact date of birth?
October 16, 1940.
And where were you born?
Lahore, India.
And please tell us about your father.
My father's name was Hermann Marcus. German names. He had a Hebrew name, Mordechai, Tzvi. I think it was Tzvi Mordechai. He never used it. The only person I ever heard use it were his parents. They would refer to him by his Hebrew name, but he always went by his German name. So he was born in 1909 in Stri, which at that point was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I think it's part of Ukraine now, if I'm not mistaken.
And can you tell us about your mother?
My mother, her name was Kate, K-A-T-E, and her maiden name was Neumann. And she was born in a town called Pyritz, P-Y-R-I-T-Z, which is in Pomerania, near Stettin, near, I suppose, relatively near Danzig. And her parents were affluent, bourgeois, assimilated types, though her father, I believe, was a member of B'nai B'rith. But she grew up in Pyritz.
And did you have any brothers or sisters?
I have a sister, but we don't speak.
Can you tell us a little bit? You've talked a little about your parents and where they were from, but can you tell us a little bit more about your family history on both sides?
Sure.
A few generations back, as far as you know.
I know very little about either set of parents' backgrounds. My paternal grandparents, I think, probably lived in or near the Stri much of their lives before they moved to Germany. They were cousins, I think, within the bounds of Jewish law, with second cousins, whatever. My grandmother's maiden name was Spiegel, Dvoras Spiegel, and my grandfather's name was Moshe Seltzer. And I really know very, very little about them. I know that much of their family was in Hungary. And as far as I know, every single one of them was murdered. at a certain point, I think in 1910, a year after my father was born, they moved, as so many of the other East European Jews did, the Ostjuden, moved to Germany. And they settled for some reason that I don't know in the town of Oberhausen, which is apparently a really awful industrial town in the Ruhr. And in my family, it was often known as Unterhausen instead of Oberhausen. My grandparents were very, very simple people. They were very, very religious. They were related to one of the great Hasidic rabbis, the Gerer Rebbe. And they moved to Oberhausen, not knowing a word of German. I think later on in life, my grandfather in particular thought that he knew German when he was speaking to me, and I thought I knew Yiddish, but I think we understood each other despite that, because there was a lot of mutual sympathy. But they moved to Puritz, and my grandfather worked as a peddler, door to door, selling things like sewing needles or whatever. So they were very poor, but very devout. My father and his siblings, he had 3 siblings, all went to secular schools in Germany. I assume they spoke Yiddish at home, but they certainly were fluent in German. They all had horrible memories of school there. I think there were quite a few Jewish kids in the school, but the anti-Semitism was overt, not only from the children in the school, but from the teachers. To compound matters, as you probably remember, when the war was over, the First War was over, or maybe even before, there was an Allied blockade of Germany. And that created near famine conditions. There was a lot of hunger. And so my father remembers not only the anti-Semitism, but the famine. He never had enough food to eat. Anyway, my father graduated from school and decided he wanted to become a doctor. I can't see you anymore, Crispin. I don't know if that matters. Crispin? I think we've lost the connection.
Okay, let me.
Oh, here he is again.
Okay.
I'm here.
How much further do you want me to go in terms of my father's history?
It's very interesting. Please do, yeah. As much as you know about this.
My father's older brother, his name was Joseph, a very sweet, gentle kind of person who seemed when I think of him, it seems almost that he was destined to be a victim of everything in life. But he decided he wanted to go to university, and for some bizarre reason wanted to study mining engineering. So somehow his father scraped up enough money to make that possible. And Jupp went off to university. But then my father came along and decided he wanted to go to university and study medicine. And my grandfather said, "You can't do that because we need you to help support the family." And my father, this will give you an indication of what kind of person he was. He said, "I don't care, I'm going." So Jupp told me the story. And he told it in a very kind of forgiving way, but it saddened him. He had to leave university and go home and help support the family so that my father could go on and have an illustrious medical career. My father's 3 siblings, one was Jupp. The whole family, without my father, migrated to the land of Israel in 1937 or 38. And had their various careers. Jupp worked as a civil servant in the department that kept voters' lists current. Yehuda, who was a great ox of a fellow, he was not at all bright, but he was very strong and very bombastic and very full of himself, and got on everyone's nerves. I rather liked him. he worked as a construction worker, and he looked it. He looked like your typical, with arms this thick and so on. He joined the Jewish Brigade during the war, and when they were in Italy, they came across a monastery, and they went into this monastery, and they found a whole bunch of Jews in the monastery, sheltering there. And one of them was a woman called Sabina, and my uncle Yehuda and Sabina sort of fell in love with each other, and they got married. I don't know if they got married in Italy, but anyway, she went back to the land of Israel as well. And everyone looked down on Job because he was such a dumb, bombastic character, though I say I liked him. But then at a certain point, he started trading Israeli stamps. Already by the early 1950s, there were quite a few fairly rare and valuable Israeli stamps. And he became very wealthy. And that irked his siblings no end, because they enjoyed looking down on him, and he enjoyed saying, basically, fuck you to them. And so that was that. And then my Aunt Shula, she married some guy, I can't remember his name. They got divorced. They had one son, Emrod, who was a paratrooper, and he was injured badly in the Six-Day War. And then later he was killed in a stupid car accident. Shula was a very beautiful woman, and she told me that the Haganah, before 1948, used her really, what's the term, like a honeypot, to kind of seduce English soldiers and get intelligence information from them.
Honey trap.
Honey trap. So she was a honey trap. And you could see it. Even when I knew her, she was a very attractive woman. But when I knew her, she was a lovely woman. She worked in the middle of Jerusalem. There's a Kikar Zion right at the center of the town. And there was this fantastic little coffee shop bakery called Kapulski's. And she was the manager of Kapulski's. And whenever I went to visit her, I was allowed to go behind the counter and take just one cake. And I'll never forget that. And that first time that I was in Israel, which was in 1952, 53, I was there in Jerusalem when Weizmann died. I don't know what the date was, but Weizmann died. And next to Kapulski was Steinmatzky, the booksellers, of which she later became manager. But so she popped over to Steinmatzky's and bought a copy of Weizmann's autobiography. It's called Trial and Error. And she inscribed it to me in the name of my grandparents, with the date, which was the date of Weizmann's death. And I still have that book, and I kind of treasure it as a souvenir of the times and of my Aunt Shula. So, I mean, they're all dead, of course, all those people. I'm in touch with one of Shula's children. His name is Kobi Yaakov. He works at some kind of mechanical thing at one of the big Intel fabs in Israel.
You mentioned that your maternal grandparents were very devout. From what you know of your family in Germany, in the 1930s, let's say, before they left, or before your immediate family left, what do you know of their sort of religious observance or cultural observances and that kind of thing?
Oh, they went by the Shulchan Aruch. I mean, they were very, very, in part because of the Gera thing. When they got to Israel, my grandfather wanted to move to Mea Sharim, which is, is the ultra-Orthodox area of Jerusalem. But my grandmother refused, not because she didn't like the place, but because she was certain that her children would never visit her there, or would rarely visit, because they were, in one case, kind of militantly secular. So they lived I can't remember what the part of Jerusalem's called. They lived in an apartment building and not in a particularly religious area.
And what about your immediate family?
What do you mean by that?
Your parents and sister, like growing up?
They were not in the least bit religious. Not in the least bit religious. No.
Would they have celebrated Jewish holidays?
No. Well, with one exception, and I'll come to that in a moment because it's such a bizarre story. But in Lahore, when I was a child, there was nothing Jewish in our house. I mean, if there was a menorah there, it was just a decorative item along with other decorative. There was nothing Jewish at all, and there's no talk about Jewish things. I don't even know how I knew I was Jewish because my parents never said. But at Pesach, my father would eat chapatis. You couldn't get matzot there. But I never really understood why was the rest of us eating chapatis? It was my father. My father would eat chapatis. That was the one sort of Jewish observance that that I recall.
And what do you know, just sort of trying to understand more of your parents and sister in Germany and the kind of the world they grew up in and where they fit into it. Where would you say they were in terms of, socioeconomically?
Well, my mother's family was pretty affluent. My grandfather had the liquor monopoly, either in all of Pomerania or in that part of Pomerania. So anyone who wanted to buy liquor, any stores wanted to sell liquor, had to go through him. I think that's a fairly well-known office, and so yeah, they were prosperous. They were prosperous, but of course, my other grandparents were poorer than a dormouse.
So was it Neumanns that were prosperous, or the other side, the Salzers?
The Neumanns, my mother's parents.
Right.
And if I can just make a point, if they had been less prosperous, and if their siblings, their families had been less prosperous, they'd have left Germany sooner. My father's family, being poor, really poor, had nothing keeping them there. And I think they left, if I'm not mistaken, either 1936 or maybe even earlier. But my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, left in 38. And they had to wait to get their visas to go to Palestine. And so they actually spent about a year with my parents in Lahore, waiting for these visas. But I think their two sons got them and they went directly there and started their lives. They both became members of bus driving cooperatives. Eged and Dan in Tel Aviv and in, I think, Haifa.
And your parents, what did they do for a living?
They were both doctors, physicians. They both left Germany in 1933 when Hitler came to power. If I can digress a moment, my father, he never told me this, but I sensed that he must have been a member of some kind of communist or anti-Nazi group because he was arrested by the Nazis when they came to power, and he was thrown in jail. And this was time apparently when they were still building Dachau. And the jails acted like as holding pens for Dachau, to which apparently he was destined. His father, my grandfather, managed to scrape up a little bit of money and went to the local Polish consul and bribed him into issuing a Polish passport to my father. So on the strength of that, he was released from the jail, but told, you may not leave Germany. We'll come and get you later. So he got right on the train and headed for Italy. But at the border, the border guards had a list of people, their blacklist, not allowed to leave the country. And there was his name on this list. But his name on that list was spelled in the German way, Selzer, whereas on the Polish passport it was Zelcer. And so he managed to persuade them that, no, this must be someone else. This is not me. and they let him through. So that's how he got to Italy. My mother, of course, just took a train and went with. The reason they went to Italy was that Italy was not only relatively receptive to German refugees, but in particular, the Italian medical schools recognized what we would call credits of German medical schools, so that a lot of German Jewish medical students went to Italy and completed their studies and got their MDs in Italy. And that's what my parents did. But yeah, they met at the university there. My father, kind of interestingly, who had no money, was taken in as a boarder by an Italian Jewish family in exchange for teaching their sons German. And this was, interestingly, the Modigliani family, not of the artist, but another branch. And one of the people my father taught went on to become a Nobel Prize-winning economist at MIT. But he had no further connection with them. So that's what they did. In 1938, when the year they graduated,
Sorry to interrupt, Michael.
Sure.
This was in Rome?
Yes. So in 1938, the year they graduated, Mussolini decided he didn't want to have foreigners enjoy residence permits, and he revoked all the residence permits of foreigners. It was basically an anti-Jewish step because there are a lot of Jewish refugees there. So my parents had to leave, and my father had managed to get himself a postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford University Medical School. So that was great. They were married. They were going to go to America. The only problem was the American embassy wouldn't give them a visa, apparently because of my father's criminal record. So, there weren't too many places you could go to. You could go to Shanghai. You could go to some godforsaken place in South America, Central America. But they met someone and said, well, why don't you go to India? India's a really interesting country, and it's run by the British, so it's fairly well run, etc. So they decided to go to India.
And what was your father's supposed criminal record?
He'd been arrested. You remember I told you? And it was never very clear. My guess is he was a communist, but certainly some anti-Nazi thing. And that, as far as the US State Department was concerned, was reason enough to withhold a visa. So they went to India, and
How did they get them?
They got on a Japanese freighter, which dropped them off in Ceylon, I don't know, Colombo, wherever it was, in Ceylon. Then they took a train from the south, and they took a train right up India, stopping off various places to see if this is where they wanted to live. And finally, they got to Lahore. And Lahore is an awful place now, but Lahore is a beautiful city. It's an ancient city full of wonderful parks and magnificent houses, all sorts of monuments, Mughal monuments, later ones. There's this magnificent museum, which is the starting point of Rudyard Kipling's Kim. Kipling's father was in charge of the museum, early on. And Rudyard Kipling had felt his first job was in the local newspaper, the Civil and Military Gazette. So there was an awful lot of good stuff there. It was a kind of military headquarters, also headquarters of a lot of the British administration of the Punjab province. It was the capital of the Punjab, universities, everything. So my parents thought, this is a really nice place. And I don't know, they rented a house or whatever they did and hung up their shingle. And
just to clarify, what year did they arrive in India?
38. So I think maybe even to their astonishment, their practice just mushroomed. It just grew spectacularly. And before long, to hear my parents tell, I have no reason not to doubt it, they were like the most prominent doctor in Lahore. And in India, being a doctor is important because everyone falls sick there. Now, why were they so successful? Their patients were mainly these upper-class Indians, of whom there was a very large number, wealthy, educated, cultured people. All of them, or just about all of them, were nationalists, whether Muslim or Hindu. They were nationalists. And as such, they didn't like the British. They wanted to see the British out of India. And at that point, the only non-Indian doctors, and they didn't want to go to Indian doctors, they didn't respect them, the only other doctors they could go to were English doctors. And they didn't want to go to English doctors if they could help it. So now all of a sudden comes this young couple, and when they were asked, where are you from? They said, Germany. They didn't want to say they in Italy, because they weren't really from Italy. I mean, though they spoke the language, they were from Germany. And that excited these people in Lahore, because the Germans were anti-British. And what could be better if you were an anti-British Indian nationalist than not to go to an Indian doctor, but to go to a German doctor? So very soon, in the sort of argot of the times, my father, who's basically ran the practice, my father was known as the Germany doctor, the German doctor. And I mean, that was like worth 5 stars. And people flocked to the Germany doctor, not only from Lahore, but from the Northwest Frontier Province, from all over. They came. And then in the summer, my parents, as many other people, moved to Srinagar in Kashmir for the cooler weather. And a lot of their patients went. And then also in Srinagar, the ones, like a lot of Maharajas went to Srinagar. And a number of them became my parents' patients. And to his dying day, my father had on his desk a signed, an inscribed photograph of the Maharani of Jaipur, who was a very famous and very beautiful. She was one of his patients. So I mean, fabulous. You know, they couldn't have wanted for anything better.
And what branch of medicine did you practice?
You didn't in those days. I mean, there was such a shortage. You were just general. You know, there were basically no specialists in those days. It's certainly not there. So all was well. All was well. But they had to pay a price for being the Germany doctor, because by the time the war broke out, the British security people not only were alert to the danger of the nationalists creating all sorts of problems for the British hold on India, they also worried about German spies and so on. And here's this guy called the Germany doctor, you know, nab him. So that's why my parents were nabbed. To say we are Jewish refugees cut no ice at all. So we were arrested. I was about 3 or 4 weeks old. My sister was about 2 years old. And we were put on a train. Apparently, there were armed guards accompanying us all the way. And my parents were in, you know, handcuffs. And almost halfway across India, like a 2-day train journey, brought them to a place called Purandar. Purandar is I've never been there. It's a little kind of, well, of course I've been there, but I don't know it. It's a little kind of mountain town, and apparently quite a nice little place, nice weather and so on. And there was this prison camp there. And I have almost no recollection of Purandar. Not really. I have one souvenir that someone gave my father from their little statue that he had carved. I still have it. But other than that, I really have no recollection of it. But my father was appointed camp doctor. And at a certain point, he got a very clear inkling that the camp commander, an Anglo-Indian, was taking a lot of the medicine that was being supplied to the camp and selling it on the black market. I mean, why not? Perk of the job, right? So this didn't please my father. So he contacted the Red Cross. And they sent an inquiry, a commission of inquiry there to Purandar. And whatever happened to the commander, I don't know. The net result for us was we were kicked out of Purandar. Obviously troublemakers. And we were sent to a camp further south in a place called Satara. And Satara was very much harsher. Satara was a horrible place. I think where we were was probably an old army camp. And we lived in Nissen huts, which the English equivalent of Quonset huts. It was a place without running water, without electricity.
Did you pause the recording?
No, I didn't touch the camera. It went on standby. It's recording again. I don't know why it just went on standby.
Shall I
I
continue?
expect it's recording again.
So shall I continue?
Yes.
Okay.
So you're telling us about the huts.
Yes.
in,
So they were, each family had a little partitioned area. My father built a little fence outside it, so we had a little private courtyard. But the other side of our partition, there was a Nazi family. Most of the people at Satara were Nazis. Some were Italian fascists, but most of them were German Nazis, and many of the Nazis were missionaries. So the guy next to us was a missionary, and I don't remember this, my parents told me that he would make a point at mealtimes of saying grace very loudly and invoking God's blessing on the Führer so that we could hear this, a piece of work. But one afternoon, I woke up from my nap to hear this terrible screaming sound. And it turned out that a Führer-loving Hitler, missionary, had put his foot into a shoe in which a scorpion resided. And the scorpion bit him, and very, very painfully. So the shriek I heard was our Nazi missionary getting his comeuppance, so far as we were all concerned. The conditions in Satara were really, as I say, I think I said, harsh. The place was ugly. I don't remember seeing flowers there, for instance. It was just a dump. And as I say, there was one other Jewish family there, but no other Jewish children. And all the rest were Germans and Italians, and most of them were Nazis and fascists. There were a very, very few non or anti-Nazi Germans, and they became part of this little circle in which my parents were also. There was this one Jewish family. He was a dentist, and they were kind of elderly, and their name was Zuckerbecker. And old Mrs. Zuckerbecker, whenever she was feeling particularly depressed, would come and play with me because I always cheered her up. So that was my contribution to the well-being of Satara. But other than that, there was very little joy. No toys. I had no toys, which in a way was good. You have to improvise, mud and sticks and stones. No books. There was one book, and I'll show that later, a wonderful children's book explaining the Nazi menace, done by a wonderful artist friend of my parents, who was a German but who was not interned. He was in Delhi. It's a lovely book. But other than that, no books. And my father never entered in the picture. My father never said anything. My father never did anything. I don't know what he was like a piece of furniture. My mother, who was an inventive person, among other things I remember, she would have to cook on a Primus stove. I mean, that's how food was done. At bedtime, she would start telling a story, a bedtime story. And that was nice. But then she would pause, and then she would have my sister continue the story, invent her own continuation of it. And after that, I had to. And I didn't know how to do that. I mean, I was like 3 years old or whatever. And I really hated that. So whatever kudos my mother got for telling the story was negated by this burden that was placed on me. I don't remember any. I'm sure I had playmates, um, and I'm sure most of their parents were Nazis. And like all the other little children, well, we all spoke German. Like the other little children, I called the grown-ups Tante or uncle, aunt or uncle. And at a certain point, my mother said to me, "You've got to stop calling them that. They're not your uncles and aunts. From now on, you're going to call them Herr or Frau, Mr. or Mrs." And I remember that I just think that made me really uncomfortable because all of a sudden, all the little playmates were talking about uncle this and that. And I had to say Herr or Frau. It was very awkward to me, and I didn't fully understand because my mother said, "Well, they're Nazis." I didn't know what Nazis were, but I knew they weren't our kind of people. I learned later, much later, that there was a tree, a big tree in the middle of the camp, and the Germans and the Italians would enjoy pointing the tree out to my parents and to the Zuckerbeckers and saying, "When Rommel comes through, we're going to hang you from this tree." But of course, Rommel didn't come through.
Did you know, or did your parents ever sort of tell you whether they knew what was happening at this time in Europe to European Jews?
Oh, I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't know. Sorry, I have to get my glasses. I don't know how people got the news. Certainly, they didn't have radios. My guess is maybe the camp produced some kind of little news sheet, which would have been very propagandist kind of news sheet. But I don't know beyond that how any kind of news. But certainly, I mean, I think that certainly they had no reason to believe that the Nazis had become any nicer to the Jews. Once the war broke out, but I don't think they knew anything like that. At a certain point, my mother got word that her father had died. And I don't know how the word came to her. There was some mail service. There's some letters could be censored. And probably she got a letter saying your father's died. And I remember her crying really bitterly. I'd never seen an adult cry before, and that left a lasting impression on me. But no, news, I'm not sure that I knew that there was a war on. I'm not sure I knew what a war was. I'm sure my parents did. So, yeah, there was something else I wanted to mention. When the war ended, the few anti-Nazi friends of my parents and the Zuckerbeckers gathered in this little courtyard that my father had created. And I loved that little courtyard. In one corner of it, I don't know how it got there, there was a gooseberry bush. And my sister and I would go out almost every day and look at the gooseberry. There were 2 gooseberries to see how they were growing. Were they ready to eat? And then they were never ready. So finally we said, well, screw that, and we just ate them, before they were ripe. And then one day, for some reason, a little puppy entered our courtyard. A little black, sort of more or less spaniel kind of puppy. And I just fell in love with this animal. And I asked my parents if we could keep it, and they said yes. So we kept it, and I gave it the name Jumbo for some reason. And Jumbo remained with my parents till I was about 16 or 17. And I still remember the dog, and I still love the dog. He was a wonderful dog. So anyway, the war ended, and these 8 or 10 people gathered in our courtyard, and they were drinking heavily. And one person had a violin, and he was playing the violin, and people were sobbing. It was very emotional, even for me. And everyone thought, well, now, happy days are here again. But we weren't reckoning with the British.
What was the reaction of the non-Jewish Germans in the camp to the end of the war?
Well, I don't really know, but I know that one thing that a lot of them did, they would produce letters certifying that they had always been anti-Nazi, and they would ask my parents to sign these letters. And of course, my parents refused to do so. Then there was this old woman, we called her die alte Hexe. Hexe is a witch. And she was always really mean to all the children, I mean, Jewish or non-Jewish. And eventually, when we left the camp, she stood by the side of the road weeping. She would miss us all, die alte Hexe. I remember her. But anyway, you know, the war ended. Everyone was very
Michael, sorry, to interrupt. I wanted to ask a couple of more questions just
Sure.
about Satara before we move on. Do you have a sense of what you ate in the camp?
I don't know. I mean, I have no idea. I wouldn't be surprised if it was pretty crappy stuff, but I don't remember being hungry. But I don't remember any sort of treat-like things, no candy, no ice cream, no cakes. It was kind of rudimentary stuff. I don't remember birthdays being celebrated. The first birthday I had celebrated, I was 6. That was my first celebrated birthday.
And were there any sort of attempts at education?
Yeah, there was a kind of kindergarten. And I was really eager to go, and I was too young, but they made an exception for me because I wanted to go to the kindergarten. I wanted to learn to read and write and so on. And this kindergarten, I was the only Jewish child there, but it was all in German, of course. And we learned all sorts of German songs. Vetted, I'm sure. I mean, none about the Führer and so on. The Horst Wessel song wasn't sung there. But one song I do remember was, it began, Nun ade du mein lieb Heimatland. Do you understand it? Farewell now, my dear homeland. And all the nostalgia for, you know, our wonderful homeland. Of course, it wasn't my homeland. I never even thought it was my homeland, but I knew the song. And I liked singing, so I'd join in. Anyway, with the end of the war and the expectation...
Oh, sorry, Michael.
Sure, go ahead.
A couple more questions. Were there any contacts with locals when you were in Satara?
No, every now and then, one of my father's patients, but always, you know, a Maharaj or something, not just upper class, but Maharaj, would put in a request to be examined by my father, and he would get on a train and go to Bombay or whatever and check out this patient and then have to come back. But I think that only happened about 8 or 9 times.
And did you learn English at all in the camp?
We spoke English at home, because my parents didn't want us to speak German. We had to speak German outside because that's what everyone spoke. But inside, my parents never spoke German to me.
And where did they learn English?
They were educated people. I mean, even those days, even German university students would know English.
And one final question, and this may be more relevant in the post-camp period, but were you aware, or did your parents talk about being aware of broader events in India?
No. I mean, my parents would have known about the whole Indian nationalist movement from their Lahore times, if nothing else. But no, I wasn't aware of any of that.
Okay, so tell us what happened next.
Okay, so the war ended, and just about the first thing my father did was to send a letter to Stanford and said, you know, 7, 8 years ago, whatever, you were very kind to offer me a fellowship, and such and such has happened now, and we're destitute, etc., etc. Any chance of you offering me some kind of work there? So astonishingly, and I was so happy when my son went to Stanford. Astonishingly, they offered him that same postdoctoral fellowship. So boy, was that exciting. I mean, I didn't know what America was, except that I sort of knew it was like there was this hill with a shining city on top of it, but I didn't know anything really much about it. I knew it was a wonderful place. And my parents told other people, everyone was so happy for us and so jealous of us. It was just like a big deal that one of these prisoners was going to get to go to America. And then, then there came a letter from the American Embassy in New Delhi. No. Now, not because he had been an anti-Nazi or whatever he'd been in Germany, but because we had been imprisoned by the British. So we got it coming and we got it going. So that must have been shattering for my parents. Anyway, what the British wanted to do was to repatriate us to the Vaterland. I mean, I have many fond memories of Britain, but there's such bitterness in me as well about them. They wanted to send us back to Germany. And there were all sorts of organized efforts to try to prevent it. There was a delegation of British MPs headed by Herbert Morrison, a Labour MP, who came and visited us, and then he heard that we were going to be sent back. So anyway, in the end, the British decided not to repatriate us, knowing perhaps that in due course they were about to be repatriated anyway themselves. So we were free. We went to Bombay for a few months. I don't know why. We stayed in an apartment building, and Bombay was magical. I'd never been in a car before. These pictures you see sometimes of like really backward villages, little kids running after a car that happens to be. I was one of those kids, never been, I mean, I'm sure as an infant maybe, but I'd never been in a car. I'd never seen electric lights. My sister turned on a switch with wet hands, she got an electric shock. We didn't know about these things. Elevators. We were in like the third or fourth floor in an apartment building. Never seen a building with more than one floor. I mean, everything was just magical. I remember Bombay very, very vividly. I remember, for instance, we once took a little trip around the harbor in a motorboat, and the harbor was full of warships. And they had camouflage painting on them. And I asked my father what that was about, and he said, I remember this very clearly, so you can't tell in what direction they're going, which I remember that. I remember near the harbor there was there was a pier, and on the pier there was a Chinese restaurant. I remember going to a Chinese. I didn't even know what China was, but we went to this. If that restaurant is still there, I could find it today. You drove down the sort of the big road. I think it's called the Beach Candy Road, and there was this tall tower, and on top of the tower there were all these vultures, and you couldn't see it. But I asked for an explanation. The Parsis put their bodies there, and the vultures would come and eat those bodies. So I remember that. Bombay was kind of magical to me, and the local Jewish community, which I think was mainly made up of Baghdadi Jews from Iraq. I think my father borrowed money from them, so because we were destitute, so that he could reestablish things in Lahore. But they gave me a nice toy train set, and that was like the first toy I've had. Well, we eventually got on a train, went to Lahore. I wasn't allowed to take my train set because we didn't have room. But when we get to Lahore, we'll buy you another one, which they never did. I still don't forgive them for that. Anyway, we got to Lahore, and we stayed in a boarding house at first, and that's where I had my sixth birthday. And I think I said I'd never had a birthday before. And so my mother asked me what kind of cake would I like to have for my birthday. And I'm sure in Bombay I'd eaten cakes, because I certainly hadn't in Satara. But I knew the cake I really liked was just the simplest one, a pound cake. And my mother said, no, you've got to have a better one, a bigger. I said, no, we had this whole thing, and finally I got my pound cake. I didn't like things to be very complicated. I think I didn't trust them. You can trust a pound cake because there'll always be pound cakes, but a Sachertorte or whatever, no, those you can't expect to ever come across again. So I had my pound cake, and I probably got some toys as a birthday present, though I don't remember that. Anyway, in Bombay, the time we were there, I went to school. And the school was the Convent of Jesus and Mary. We get to Lahore, I go to school. It was the Convent of Jesus and Mary. And one of the little girls there, our families became very good friends, and she's still my very good friend, though she's now dying of cancer in Stockholm. She told...
What's her name?
Ishrat Gandhi. Now she's Ishrat Lindblad. She married a Swedish physician. He converted to Islam. They have 3 or 4 children. She's a wonderful woman, very, very bright. But she told me that the Convent of Jesus Mary, where she was also, that's where we first made the connection, it was segregated. The native children were taught in different classrooms from the what we'll call European ones. I find that shocking. So that was my second Convent of Jesus and Mary. And after a while, I no longer went there. I went to the Cathedral School, which was Anglican. And after that, I went to St. Anthony's School, which was run by Belgian monks for some reason. All the schools I went to were Christian, actively Christian. In the summer when we went to Kashmir, the summer of '47, I went to school there, to Convent of Jesus and Mary again. And eventually, when my parents decided enough of these convents of Jesus and Mary, they sent my sister and me to Woodstock School in Mussoorie, India. But Woodstock School was an American missionary school. So I've had and I had no Jewish education, but boy, I could sing hymns, and I knew all sorts of things.
Was there any of school procedure where they would say, if you're not a Christian student, please leave at this point, or everyone was just expected?
Yeah, everyone. I mean, how many? You mean the Muslims were off in their own classrooms?
I'm asking.
Yeah, the Muslims are. I don't know what they did with their prayers there, but no, Jesus loves me. This I know because the Bible tells me so. I mean, I can go on and on and on. So at a certain point, my parents became very, very prosperous again, and they bought this fantastic house set in huge gardens. It was just a wonderful old house. And what really triggered off was not just the wealthy Pakistanis, as they now were, but Aramco, the Arabian American Oil Company, which was now drilling very, very actively in the Arabian Peninsula, and needed all sorts of people, technicians, and this, that, and the other. And they wanted to recruit them in a Muslim country, and Pakistan was it. But before they could employ them, they had to get a clean bill of health. So literally thousands of these people applying for Aramco jobs had to first be given a complete medical checkup by my father. And that brought in a huge amount of money. So we were now doing very, very well again in those in those terms.
Michael, let's just take a quick break. We need to pause the recording and do something with the camera.
Okay, and I'm rolling.
And Michael, just before we took that break, before we carry on, in about Lahore and the post-war period, I wanted to ask just what are your earliest memories?
My earliest memories are all in Satara. And some of them I don't want to talk about, if you don't mind.
Are there any that you can talk about?
I remember, well, I mentioned my mother crying when her father died. I remember being in my bathtub. That was a little like tin thing on the floor, sitting in there, and my father came in and told my mother to hurry up because they needed to go to a funeral because one of the kids I played with had gotten drowned. So that is one of my memories. Another more congenial memory, there was a rather older boy from, I think, a non or even perhaps anti-German, Nazi German family. His name was Rainer Brocker. And Rainer was probably a teenager at that point. And he had this wonderful metal boat, like an ocean liner, which you could wind up in the propeller. And there was a water tank, like this high off. And he would go and play with his boat in the water tank. And I remember doing that. I remember once my mother made, well, that's interesting because I didn't think they were cakes. She had made a cake for, I think, Mrs. Zuckerbecker. And I did that, so there must have been cakes there. Anyway, so she asked me to bring this cake to Mrs. Zuckerbecker, and I took the cake on this platter, and some eagle or vulture, whatever, came right down here and snatched it away, brushed its wings. That was a terrifying experience. And then I got really scared because I thought I would be held responsible. It was my fault. So those are some of the memories I have.
And I wanted to ask you were talking about Lahore already after it was part of Pakistan and your family was re-establishing itself. What do you remember, or do you have memories about the partition? In 47?
I have a lot of memories of that. I remember hearing a mob. It was a terrifying sound. And we were on the canal bank and they were in Anarkali. It was quite a distance, but I remember hearing the mob. I don't know, Hindus killing Muslims or Muslims killing Hindus, whatever. And then once where we lived was on a road that led into the canal bank, the canal. And at the junction there, I remember once seeing a pile of corpses. Again, I don't know, Hindu or Muslim. Then we spent the summer in Kashmir, and on the way back, we drove. On the way back, we came to this convoy of trucks. I guess there were 30 or 40 of them, full of refugees, Hindus fleeing to India. And it was really difficult for our driver to kind of pass them, but eventually we passed them. Then we came to a road which led to the village from which the driver had come originally. And he asked if it would be okay if we went and visited to make sure his family was okay. So he got out of the car, it was just a few yards away, went into this village, and the whole convoy passed us again. So then we had to eventually get back and pass. Those are my partition memories, but just kind of immediately post-partition and connected with partition in a way. I think it was very early in 1948, not long after independence, that Gandhi was assassinated. And in those days, I was reading newspapers. I couldn't hold them. I'd have them on the floor, and I'd kind of crawl up and down the columns. I loved reading newspapers. And I read that Gandhi had been assassinated. And I knew Gandhi was a Hindu. And therefore, it was a good thing that Hindus are assassinated. So I went around saying to everyone, it's great, isn't it wonderful? Gandhi's been assassinated. And everyone was really shocked, I mean, including the Muslims. They said, no, Gandhi was a really good man. You mustn't say that. It was really a terrible thing. So that I learned that. And the person who really told me about this was someone called Rosie. Rosie was a Goanese Christian, and she was black as coal. And she had the warmest heart I've ever met. And she was my ayah, like my nursemaid or whatever you call them, my governess. And I just loved Rosie. Rosie was more of a mother to me than any mother I'd ever known before. But she was stern with me sometimes, but she's just so warm-hearted, and she had 3 children and whom I really enjoyed. One of them actually came to visit me when I was at Oxford. I mean, that's how long. And every time I came back to Lahore, Rosie would always come and visit. She's the most wonderful, wonderful woman.
Did she have a last name?
Pinto. Rosie Pinto. And her youngest daughter was called Agnes. And for a while, I had a little crush on Agnes. When she came to visit me at Oxford, I thought, well, maybe now's the time, But I thought, no, this would be too complicated, too complicated. But at least Agnes got to leave Pakistan and settle in England because they were Catholics.
Do you know through your parents if any of their kind of Hindu patients were affected in Lahore by the?
I think they all left, except for one man. His name was Guy Sethi. And Guy Sethi was a very wealthy, very civilized, lovely man, a bit reserved. And everyone in Lahore loved him. And all the, wealthy Pakistanis included him in their circle. And there was never any danger of him being discriminated against, let alone being assaulted. And I think he eventually died in Lahore. I mean, he just lived there. He was the only Hindu. Well, that's not quite true, because we had a servant called Bajjar. And Bajjar was our sweeper. We didn't have vacuum cleaners, we had Bajjar. And Bajjar, with his broom, would just keep everything clean. He was an untouchable. So he didn't particularly want to go back to India. And then he had a wife. She was always known as Bajjar Ka Bibi, Bajjar's wife. I don't know what her name was. She had no teeth. They were old, fragile people. And they stayed with us till the end, I think. But he was the other Hindu that I knew.
And what do you remember of life in Lahore at that time? Post, I guess, with it becoming, like a Muslim Pakistani city.
I enjoyed my life. I mean, Lahore was a lovely place. All my friends were Muslim. They're all dead now. I was increasingly really curious about life in the West. I think for me that was magical. One of my father's cousins, whose family left Germany long before Hitler and settled in the United States, his name was Sam Wallach. Do you know the actor Eli Wallach? Eli Wallach is Sam's something or the other. And Sam was the kind of bead and sequin king of New York. He had bead and sequin factories, and he made bead and sequin kits and so on. He was a very wealthy man, and he loved his beads and sequins. Anyway, one year, probably 48, Sam sent my sister and me a gift. And the gift was, we each got a $10 or a $5 bill. And accompanying that $5 bill was the most magical book I'd ever seen in my life, the Sears Roebuck catalog. And the idea was we'll pick out something from the catalog, which I did. I bought one of those kind of leather helmets lined with shearling, for the cold weather. That's what I bought. But for me, this was the most magical thing. And you could have everything then. So I would invent, whole things. You could buy a house. So I would buy a house, and then you could buy the furniture, and I would choose the furniture, and I would choose this and that, everything to go with it, and clothes and toys, and this and that and the other. And I remember really regretting that I didn't have enough money to buy, and I still wish I had. You could get, those trucks which carry cars, car carriers, whatever. Well, you could get a truck like that, which was filled with lifesaver rolls of lifesavers, in different flavors. Going across that, I thought, oh my God, I would give anything to have that, but I didn't have the money for that. But so for me, that was the West, was Sears Roebuck. And many, many years later, I met, and it was a wonderful experience. I met someone called Lessing Rosenwald. And Lessing's father was the guy who basically made Sears Roebuck. And Lessing was a very wealthy man, and he was an extraordinary collector of rare books and of paintings, and both of those are now in the Library of Congress. And I told him about my first encounter with America was with his dad's catalog, and he got a chuckle out of that.
Question, and it is related, but it's immediately specific and then I'll relate later. What did you see of the British leaving?
I didn't. I mean, I'm not sure I really noticed it. And, the British may have left, but Lahore was full of them still. And for instance, the commander-in-chief of the Pakistani army was a guy called General Gracie, who was an English general. I think for quite a while, the Governor General of the Punjab was English. It took quite a while to, I mean, they didn't disappear from one day to the next. The main club in Lahore, I blush to say this was called the Punjab Club. And it was for English people only. Indians, Pakistanis weren't allowed in. And the exception was my parents. My parents were made members of it. And I always felt kind of ambivalent about, should they accept that? But it was blatant. And then finally, only about 20 years ago, the Pakistani government seized the club and made it into some kind of civil service academy or something.
So the sort of wonder and excitement you had about the West wasn't the British West, or was it?
Oh no, the British was. I mean, you'd see pictures of people in London. It was like under the Labour government and all these shortages, all the rationing, all the fog, and all the. No, it wasn't. No, it was America, and British cars were so drab.
And you mentioned earlier kind of a sense of bitterness towards the British. Where did that sort of, what kind of prompted that, do you think?
What prompted that was the prison camps. What prompted that was them wanting to send us to Germany.
So tell me about the next steps in Lahore and what happened.
Well, what happened was that having gone to all these schools in Lahore and so on, my parents finally sent me to England. But I'd like, if you don't mind, to digress a little bit. I told you my father had this enormous practice, and part of that practice was consisted of Pathans. I think they're called Pashtuns now. These are the people from the tribal areas up in the north, the Khyber Pass and so on. A lot of them now became Talibans and so on. But in those days, they were not Talibans. But they were very martial people, big, tall, strong. They would die for you if you were their guest. They would slit your throat if you insulted them. They were magnificent people. They always walked around with weapons on them, but so many of them would also walk around with a little flower in their cap. And they'd like to recite poetry. I mean, they were extraordinary people, um, extraordinary people. And a lot of them were my father's patients. Uh, Once a year, one of these people would come down from that area. It was about 400 or 500 miles. Would come down for his annual checkup, medical checkup. And this was one of the most extraordinary men I've ever known in my life. He was called the Nawab of Hoti, Hoti Mardan, which is near the Malakand Pass and so on. And the Nawab of Hoti was what a hero. He was a huge man with a huge voice, boisterous, full of himself, a great warrior. The British had knighted him. When he came to our house, it was always with a convoy of trucks full of his heavily armed retainers. But he also brought big baskets of fruit from his orchards for us. And his checkup was just almost an excuse. There'd be chairs out in the garden, a table, lemonade, and so on. And life would stop. Even my father had to suspend his practice, and we'd all sit and listen to the Nawab. And he would talk about his adventures. He had fought in Gallipoli for the British, etc., etc. He had been to all sorts of durbars for the coronations. And he was boastful. He told me once, when I was young, I could lift a horse and its rider on my shoulders. And I believed him. I mean, God, he was my hero. I have a photograph of him here. And once he took his pugri, his turban, off his head and put it on my head. And I almost stumbled, damn thing was so heavy. And he got a big chuckle out of that. So anyway, I loved the guy. And he was very nice to me. So at a certain point, he and a lot of the other people up there invited us all up, like on a tour. So the place I remember, we went to Hoti, to his palace. Then Hoti, what a place. You come into this large courtyard, and the courtyard is lined with what I assume were stables, except there were no doors in front of it or anything like that, no animals in the stables. They were full of workshops. And what did the workshops do? The Nawab was an inventor. And so he had all these people making his inventions. And the inventions, you wouldn't believe. One was a kind of bicycle which pedaled a spit for grilling your meat. Another one, which I really loved, and I've seen them elsewhere, but this was his invention, was a tank, a military tank. When you press the button, flame came out of the barrel and you could light your cigarette with it. I mean, that kind of crappy stuff, but he loved it. Then he took us around the palace itself. I remember there was one room, he was very proud of it, 365 pairs of shoes, because he didn't want to wear the same pair of shoes twice in a year. And as a brat, I was about to say, well, what about on a leap year? And luckily, I held my tongue. But that was his room, 365 pairs of shoes. But then, and this is what is so important, then he took us to his library. Now, you wouldn't think that this warrior, this chieftain, this braggadocio and so on, he had the biggest private library I've ever seen in my life. I mean, with what I know what books look like in God, I would think there must have been at least 30 or 40,000 books in this enormous tall room, beautiful wooden bookcases. And he read. I mean, the books were in English and in Persian and whatever. And so we were sitting at one end, sofas and chairs and so on, talking, and I was kind of, and at a certain point he stopped and he got up and he said, "Come with me, Michael. I want to show you something." So he took me, we walked down the length of this library, all these bookcases lining the whole place. But at the end, the bookcases came in, but then halted. There was a blank space in front of his desk. There was his desk there. And behind there, there was this huge illustration. And what was the illustration? It was his family tree. His family tree. And he took me, he said, you see, this is me at the top. My sons will go above me in due course. But see what's over the bottom? It was in Persian, probably. He said, it's Benjamin. See, I am descended from Benjamin. And so I am a Jew. And you are a Jew. And so we are brothers. I knew who Benjamin was probably from my Catholic schools. Well, I can't tell you what the impact of this was. No one, I'd never ever heard anyone say, I am a Jew, not my parents. I'd never heard anyone say, I am a Jew. And I certainly had never heard anyone say, you are a Jew. And I was kind of alarmed because I thought you're not supposed to say that or whatever. But, you know, I felt so confident in his company. And it occurred to me that, you know, he has a tree. I have a tree. And I don't know who's at the bottom of my tree. It may be Benjamin, it may be whoever. But I have a tree. And trees grow in forests. And my tree must be part of a forest. If you will, a Jewish forest. This was such an epiphany for me, because I can't emphasize strongly enough how totally insulated I was from anything Jewish. My parents didn't want to be Jews. No way. They didn't want to be Jews. They never talked about it. I think I told you that in our house there was nothing Jewish except the chapatis, mysterious chapatis. All the schools I went to were Christian. There were two Jews in Lahore. And I knew they were Jews, and I don't know how I knew they were Jews. But both of them are remarkable people. One was a woman called Vicky Noon. She was an Austrian Jew. And she had met an Indian called Feroz Khan Noon. And they got married, and he brought her back. She was among the most beautiful women I've ever known in my life. She had red hair and green eyes, and oh boy, what she did to my adolescent hormones, I won't even dare hint at. Wonderful woman. And Feroz Khan Noon was a politician. He became Prime Minister of Pakistan, a very prominent politician. And during the British days, he'd been knighted. So she was Lady Vicky Noon. And this, in a sense, I think my parents were jealous of her, or whatever. They hated each other. But Vicky was, she was the very good friend of the mother of one of my very good Pakistani friends. So I'd encounter her in their house, and she was very nice to me always. But so that was one of the Jews. The other one was an even more remarkable man. His name was Mohammed Asad Weiss, who was a Jew, I think, from Poland and then from Frankfurt, who was a journalist, a very brilliant man. He translated the Quran, and so he converted to Islam, and he went to live in Saudi Arabia, and he became a confidant of Ibn Saud, and spent many years there in wherever that town is, and there was a falling out. So he left Saudi Arabia and came to Lahore, which was not yet Pakistan. When Pakistan came into being, he converted to Islam, right? When he became very active in all sorts of Islamic things, the Pakistanis made him ambassador to the United Nations and some other jobs. Then again, he had a falling out and he left Pakistan, and I think he died in Spain. But again, he and my parents just like, they couldn't stand each other. But he was always very nice to me. But those were the only Jews. And there was nothing Jewish overtly.
Can we take a short break there just for technical reasons?
Sure.
Big break? Okay. Okay, I'm rolling.
So my parents decided that they didn't want me to go to school in Lahore anymore. So they sent me to Mussoorie in India to this Christian missionary school run by American missionaries up in the Himalayas. And there are many things about it I really loved. It was a very outdoorsy kind of place. I became obsessed with finding different kinds of ferns. I collected ferns. I had nearly 100 different ferns pressed in a book. And it's a tragedy for me that I've lost that book. It would have been a wonderful thing to have. Very outdoorsy, very everything. Kids from all over, people sent their children from all over to all over Asia. But in the nature of things, when these kids come, one from Taiwan, one from Thailand, one from wherever, they would always talk about what things were like in their country. And then they would say, "Where are you from?" This was a nightmare for me. I felt there was something really wrong with me. I wasn't from anywhere. I couldn't say what ice cream was like in my country, or what games we played in my country, etc. I felt so not only out there, I felt kind of unreal. I had no anchor. I might have a tree, but what was the soil in my tree? And as far as I know, there were no Jewish trees there. This kid, Rainer Brock, who had the boat in Satara, he was at the school, but he wasn't Jewish. And he was too sort of big to know me. I was just a little punk, and he was a senior. And we sang, I learned all sorts of American songs. I can sing all the national anthems, the service anthems, and so on. Any number of hymns, again. But I basically felt terrible there. There were those things like all the nature stuff and so on I really loved. I felt terrible there. I was like a freak. So after 2.5 years, my parents decided they would send me to England. So I went with my sister, we went to this so-called progressive boarding school called Bedales, which was the first.
What year would that have been?
January 1953. So I was just 12. And Bedales was the first coeducational boarding school in England. So, they didn't have teachers who beat you, who whipped you, like your typical English school. They didn't have, older boys who buggered you like your typical English school. It was a much. You didn't call the teachers sir. You called them by their first names. We were on a sort of 300-acre farm, and 2 afternoons a week, instead of playing cricket or whatever, we had to work on the farm, and I learned a lot about woodworking there. I still, until my back, I've always all my life done woodworking. I learned bookbinding there. I've done bookbinding. For a while, I even earned my living as a bookbinder. But it was also a very strong academic tradition, unlike so many of these progressive schools. And of all the academic things, what really, really just grabbed me was history. We had 2 history teachers, John Slater and Roy Wake, and each of them was wonderful in his own way. Wonderful teachers, good historians, and they opened me up like no teacher could ever have opened me up before. And so I felt this enormous kinship with the past. But of course, I knew it wasn't my past. My tree wasn't growing in medieval England. Most of the history we were doing was medieval history. I loved it, and I loved that sense of knowing where things come from, and that's continuity. But it wasn't my tree wasn't in there. But I loved it anyway, and I was good at it. And the greatest medievalist of the day was someone called R.W. Southern. He became Sir Richard Southern, and he was a tutor at Balliol College, Oxford. And there was nothing I wanted more than to study under him. But Balliol was sort of like saying, I want to go to the moon. You don't get to go to the moon. But my teachers encouraged me. So I applied. And you had 2 ways of getting into Balliol. One was by sitting a written exam. And that would have been in March. But in October, instead of reading, you could go up to Balliol for 3 days and be interviewed by all the people who might be teaching you, which I thought was a much better system. Anyway, the thought of spending 3 days at Balliol, I mean, Balliol was like heaven. It's gone to the dogs now, but in those days it was preeminent. So I had all my interviews, and then I have to tell you this story because it still amuses me. In the last interview, all the history dons were sitting there and you, and they would ask you questions. And for me, it was a thrill. I mean, here were people like Christopher Hill, R.W. Southern, discussing history with me. I mean, what a dream. But then one of them asked me something about something called the conciliar epoch in the 14th century, which involved, the Catholic Church had all these councils of the church to decide on this, that, and the other. And I didn't know about the conciliar. So I said, I was very frank. I said, I haven't gotten there yet, which is a perfectly legitimate thing to say if you're studying history. I mean, I'd begun with the Venerable Bede, for God's sake. And then I had this really brilliant, really manipulative, sleazy insight. And I said, I haven't gotten there yet. But, I often think in terms of earlier periods with which I am familiar, that I ought to know what's coming next. And that would be very helpful if I could just read one book. Even before I got one book about the conciliar epoch, even before I got to it, to help me understand some of the earlier things. And then I said this, is there a single book that you would recommend I read? Well, in all the 700 years of Balliol's history, no one trying to get into college had ever asked that question. And I didn't grin with self-satisfaction, but inside I really grinned because I knew that if nothing else, that question would get me in. And so that got me in. And so at Balliol, my first couple of terms, I had Dick Southern as my tutor. And it was a thrilling, I mean, sometimes he was really aggressive and angry with crap that I was producing, he said, and so, but I mean, he was just fantastic. Well, I'll just jump up ahead one bit. Balliol had this interesting custom that at the end of every term, your tutor would take you one at a time to the master of the college. It was called handshaking. And you would sit there with the master, and your tutor would tell the master what he thought of you, or of your performance. And the master would say, I mean, our master was a bit of a dolt, he would say, well, maybe you should take up bird watching. That was his level of response. But what Southern said, and I don't say this boastfully, I just say it because it's relevant to what's about to come. Southern said, Master, Mr. Selzer is the most brilliant student I've ever had. I mean, it's like the Pope saying that, you're the most holy Catholic he's ever seen. I mean, this scared the hell out of me because it placed such a standard to live up to. But I thought, oh my God, And this was all because I had discovered something in the Doomsday Book that no one has ever discovered before, having to do with sheep raising in Wiltshire, in the county of Wiltshire. I don't even remember what it was, but I know that was the thing. Okay, so let me go back. Between leaving Bedales and going to Oxford, you have this gap year, as it's now called. And in my gap year, I spent 3 months in Lahore, which was a waste of time. And then I went to a kibbutz in Israel, where in exchange for your manual labor, they taught you the language. And you met other people. It was a great experience. But one day, on the news, I heard an announcement. I think it was actually made by Ben Gurion, saying that they've just caught Adolf Eichmann, and that they were bringing him to Israel, or he was already in Israel, and he was going to stand trial in Jerusalem. Well, this was probably the most extraordinary thing I'd ever heard in my life. Because without giving you a speech on the matter, in the long course of Jewish history, we have never sat in judgment on one of our persecutors. I mean, even Haman was hanged by order of Ahasuerus. It wasn't by one of us. And here now we were sitting on one of the major murderers in our history. And this trial would be in Jerusalem, in an Israeli court in Jerusalem. And the coming together of these things just, as we now would say, blew my mind. It seemed to me the most astonishing, it seemed like a culmination of Jewish history. And it still moves me. And I thought, I have to be at this trial. I have to go there. So when I got to Oxford, I joined one of the Oxford undergraduate magazines. The two main ones were called after the Oxford rivers, and one of the rivers there is called Isis, which is kind of embarrassing nowadays. But the magazine was called Isis, so I joined Isis, not the bad ISIS, the journalistic ISIS, and I got them to credit me as their correspondent to the Eichmann trial. And then I went to the Israeli embassy, and they were thrilled to have someone from Oxford and a young uncle. And so they not only got me the accreditation, they got El Al to fly me there, and this, that, and the other. So I went there, I went to the Eichmann trial for the first month of it. And there were a lot of really important English journalists there, and they took me under their wing, because most of them were Oxford people. And the one I had the best relationship with is someone called James Morris, if you remember him. He became Jan Morris, a fantastic journalist for The Guardian. And they were wonderful to me. And I came back and I wrote a lot of articles for ISIS. And then also for some newspapers. I think I had one in The Spectator, in the Oxford Mail, and so on. But the theme of my what I wrote was all this one that I've mentioned, that this is a culmination of Jewish history. And if you want to look at this event in Jewish history and ask why did the Holocaust happen? It wasn't called the Holocaust in those days. Why did this happen? Well, again, you have to look into Jewish history. Why did this happen? Because the dynamic in Jewish history, put it very bluntly, the people sin and they are punished. Chet chata Yerushalayim al ken lenida. Jerusalem has grievously sinned, therefore is she removed. That's the therefore that links our behavior to that event. And I said, well, the Jewish explanation is already there. It's been there from before the time our history was recorded. But then also this whole notion that this is a legitimate. The arrest of Eichmann in Britain created a wave of anti-Semitism, not unlike what we're seeing today. For instance, the Jews, all they want is revenge. The Jews are a vengeful people. And this trial is illegitimate because they snatched him off the streets of Buenos Aires. And anyway, he didn't kill Israeli people, and he didn't act in Israel. I mean, every kind of bullshit that they could come up with to deny the value of this. And then there were my articles saying this is the culmination. This is where Jewish history comes together. Boy, did my trees suddenly find a lot of soil. This is where, and people hated it. Even the Jews didn't want to know at Oxford, didn't want to know about me. And the editor of ISIS was a guy called Grey Gowrie. And Grey Gowrie was the Earl of Gowrie. And he became Margaret Thatcher's Minister of Culture or something. Then he became chairman of Sotheby's. And with the second one of my articles, or maybe the final one of my articles, he put in like a box in the middle of the page, and it was headed Seltzer Scheisse. Seltzer shit. And that was kind of the level of the response. Okay, there was another magazine run by two guys, Zwegensov and MacDonald Sproat. MacDonald Sproat became an MP subsequently, and they started a magazine called Parsons Pleasure, which is one of the river spots in Oxford. Parsons Pleasure. And the cover story, emblazoned on the cover, was Jewish fraud. And the article was all about how I had never gone to the trial. I mean, I can show you, I still have my pass, my press pass to the trial. And Jewish fraud. I mean, this was the level of response at Oxford. Then the Oxford Union, which is, you know, this very prestigious debating society, decided to have a debate. The theme of the debate was that the creation of Israel was the greatest mistake of the 20th century. And because I was the prominent Jew, I was the kind of lead undergraduate on opposing this. And it's one of my regrets that I actually argued the case. You know, the refugees came from both sides, and the Balfour, you know, all the arguing the case. Whereas what I subsequently thought, oh, I should have gotten up in my dinner jacket and all, and I should have turned to the speaker. I should have pulled down my pants, and I should have shown him my respect with my naked ass. That's what I should have done, and said, it's not worth even considering your bullshit. I wish I'd done that, but I didn't. So that was the Eichmann trial. And the Eichmann trial, I could almost say, was kind of the birth of me as a Jew.
Can you tell us a bit about your memories of the actual trial and being there?
Actually, I have to say that I was you know, it was in a theater. It was like a spectator. I was sitting up in the balcony in the Guards because I wasn't, you know, from the Guardian or London Times, and the whole thing had a fantasy quality. It didn't. I had to constantly have a real this disgusting looking man there. I mean, I don't excuse it, and she was a liar. But Hannah Arendt's notion of the banality of evil, I mean, this guy didn't have horns on his head. He didn't look like the devil. And that was the disconnect for me. Anyway, so after the trial, after this kind of birth of my Jewish self, after feeling my tree is now planted in good soil, I said, how the hell can I go back to Oxford and write papers about the Doomsday Book, about the Venerable Bede, or any of that? That's their history. It's not mine. And now I've got to study Jewish stuff. So I went to Southern, and I told him this, and I expected sympathy. And he just froze up. He said, okay, I'll arrange it. He never spoke to me again. And for me, at one level, it really was a sacrifice that I was making, because I had a great career ahead as a medieval historian at Oxford. And I was renouncing that. And every evening, 3 or 4 of my friends would gather outside Baylor where there was a guy selling hot dogs. And that would be, you know, our evening ritual. And after I returned, I said, I'm going to join you, but I no longer eat hot dogs. I don't eat pork anymore. And so on. So then I went, to what's called the Oriental Institute, which is all sorts of non-Western languages, including the Semitic languages. And that's what I studied. But I was horrified to discover how essentially anti-Semitic the study of Hebrew is at Oxford. For instance, in England, there are the Regius professorships. They're the most prestigious. And at that time, they were only at Oxford and Cambridge and only in a few subjects. And one of them, going back to, I think, the 17th century, was the Hebrew professorship, the Regius professorship of Hebrew. And to this day, it's never been held by a Jew. And the whole thrust of the biblical criticism and so on was essentially anti-Jewish, that the Bible is just a composite of different documents, competing political interests and so on. And anyway, most of it's borrowed from the Egyptians and from the Sumerians and so on. I mean, it was totally, and consciously, I think. These are all Church of England. Some of them have dog collars on, for God's sake. But I thought, I'm here. I thought, I'll do the best I can. But it was a mixed blessing giving up history. So that's what I did. when I read Hannah Arendt stuff, I was just incensed because just intuitively I knew that banal people don't do that kind of thing. Evil people do it. Um, it so happened that quite a few years later, and I can get to that if you want, I realized that there had been a psychologist, a prison psychologist of the Israeli police, who had analyzed Eichmann. They wanted to make sure he could stand the rigors of the trial or whatever. And to do that, he'd given him a whole battery of psychological tests, many of which involved drawings. So I contacted him and said, "Where are your drawings?" He said, they're in my filing cabinet. I said, "Could you send them to me? They don't belong in your filing cabinet. Send them to me, I'll study them, and I'll put them in the Library of Congress." So he did, very nice guy, Kulshar. So I got all these drawings, and I took them to, I think, 6 or 7 different psychologists in America, without saying who they were by, for their blind appraisal. And their blind appraisal was, this is the most violent, this is the most evil. I mean, anything but banal. So I wrote a long article about that. And that was actually published as a cover story in the New York Times Magazine, and was published very widely. And all the usual suspects really attacked me because, what's his name? The guy at Yale who did the electric shock experiments, if you remember those. He was Milgram, Stanley Milgram. He was with Hannah Arendt. Now, Hannah Arendt had lied, and I showed that in the article. Milgram's experiments were flawed, but because he never made an independent appraisal of the people who administered the shocks. For him, it was enough to say, "I tell you shock," so they shock. But some people didn't. So what kind of personalities were involved? So that finally kind of resolved my attitude toward liberalism, because I felt that liberals believe that if anything is wrong, it's like a machine that needs to be fixed. But if the machine doesn't need to be fixed, everything will go well. So it's not that evil isn't done by evil people. It's done by some of maladjusted people, or people who don't quite get it, who obey orders, or whatever. That doesn't make them evil. And I thought that was such an appalling and revolutionary concept, because I believe in original sin. But that all crystallized with the whole Eichmann drawings thing.
Michael, let's take a short break, another quick break.
Are we doing okay?
Yeah, Mark?
Yeah, everything's going fine. I have an hour and 6 minutes on this one card. I'm going to shut off for a second. We're rolling.
So my tree now was growing in good soil. I felt I really was in touch with a lot of Jewish things that I needed to be in touch with. Even if my tree was on the outskirts of the forest, it was still there. And I packed my bags and went to Israel. And I got a great welcome in Israel, because in those days, you could probably count on one hand the number of people who'd been to Oxford, and that was considered a big deal. I mean, I didn't consider it a big deal, but they did. It was a prestigious thing. So lots of doors were opened for me when I got there. One of the doors that was opened for me was by a man called Teddy Kollek, who had been Ben-Gurion's right-hand man, had been mayor of Jerusalem. He was a very prominent and powerful figure in Israeli life, and he was now in charge of building the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And he wanted someone to write all sorts of promotional and fundraising brochures for the museum. So he took me around, he showed me the architectural plans and so on. And I was really impressed, because the idea, if you know the museum at all, it has all sorts of little structures attached to each other. It's not one monolithic structure. And I thought, this is just like your typical Arab Hill village. They're all individually part of this kind of organic whole, and was clearly that the architect had intended, and that Kollek confirmed to me. So I wrote my draft, sent them to him, and I got an angry call, come and see me immediately. And I went to see him immediately and said, how can you be so fucking stupid? I said, what are you talking about? He said, all this business is about Arab hill villages. You've got to be an idiot to think that that's acceptable. I said, but Teddy, isn't that what you told me? Are you going to now tear these buildings down and build them like a shtetl? What's the problem here? Well, that's absolutely impossible. We're not having any of that. Get rid of it. So I said, no, you're going to get rid of me. I'm not putting up with this bullshit from you. So I left. But of course, that gave me a real insight into the mentality that they just didn't know how to relate. I mean, I'm not a pro-Arab guy. I mean, the Arabs want to kill us. I don't believe in liking people who want to kill me. And that's before October the 7th as well. But, an awful lot of Jews in Israel are from the Arab world. And a lot of them, in those days, in particular the older people, spoke Arabic and read in Arabic and not Hebrew. So the official languages in Israel are Hebrew, English, and Arabic. And Kollek had showed me a draft of the catalog for the museum. Buildings were already, this was closer to the opening of the museum, had shown me the catalog of the museum. And on each page, there was writing English, Hebrew. I don't know, maybe also French, I don't know. English and Hebrew, certainly. I said, well, what about Arabic? He said, well, we're not going to have that. I said, well, how about labeling the exhibits? No, we're not having that. I said, how about the fucking exit sign? And I was really upset. I thought, this is carrying viciousness to a point of real stupidity, by the way. So I happened to be in the King David Hotel, at the bar probably, and I saw there this little guy, flanked by 3 titanic women, 6'6", beautiful young women. And I realized this is Billy Rose, who was the great showman in America in those days. And he had given an enormous collection to the Israel Museum of sculpture, which would be, and also paid for, I can't remember his name, the Japanese-American guy to do the landscaping for it and so on. He was a major benefactor. And I said to him, do you have a minute? And I told him, this is what's going on. I mean, I'm sure you'd like to have your things readable to an Arabic-speaking person. I'm outraged. I said, I want you to find the best Arabic calligrapher in the land and engage him and have him do all these signs, and I'll speak to Kollek and so on. So, I worked with Billy Rose for a while. And then one day when I went to meet him at the hotel, he was very, very depressed. He said, it's not happening. I said, well, why is it not happening? He said, Kollek took the question, now get this, to the cabinet of the Israel government. And they all agreed under no circumstances anything Arabic. I think that was stupid, but also sort of mean-spirited. Anyway, when I got to Israel, I had read an article in an English Jewish magazine called the Jewish Observer and Middle Eastern View about the situation with the Jews from the Muslim world in Israel. And I couldn't believe this. I couldn't believe this. Because among other things, it was really familiar to me because this is exactly what the British had tried to do in India. Lord Macaulay in the 1820s had written something called the Minute on Indian Education, in which he said the way we're going to govern in India is we're going to create a class of Indians who are English in all but the color of their skin. Because everything Indian has no value, and we're going to make these people, we can't change the color of skin, but we're going to make them complete Englishmen. And this is what the Israelis were trying to do with what in those days were called Sfardim, anyway, the non-Ashkenazi, the ones from Muslim countries. And I couldn't believe it. And there were a zillion little details and everything, I mean, just not only astonished me, but really depressed me. So I wrote a long article, putting that into some kind of historical context, published in the same magazine. And I was contacted by a man called Eliyahu Eliashar, who was the head of something called the Council of the Sephardi Community of Jerusalem, Vaad Eidat HaSfardim. And he said, you know, well, what you wrote there, we've been trying to say for a long, long time. Why don't you come and work for us? So I decided I would. I could do something instead of just complaining about it. I could do something. And we quickly settled on what I would do. Israel then, as now, was very sensitive to foreign opinion. They were constantly bringing in important visitors to look at the country and kind of show them that it's not what you've heard it is. We're a wonderful place, which it is. And also the matter of integration. In another generation or two, they'll all be like we are. It's just a matter of time. So my job was to intercept these visitors with materials we had produced, never polemically. Our materials were always basically extracts of newspaper and magazine articles. So no one could say we're inventing it. We gave them the sources. And I would intercept these people and explain them to them. And they were always very, very receptive. And we then also sent these things around to major magazines and newspapers throughout the West. Like the New York Times, I remember, once had a long article about us and so on. Le Monde in Paris did. And it was very effective. And some of these people were very influential. I think I mentioned James Baldwin was one of these people, and he could really relate to this. And another one who was just an extraordinary, complex, brilliant man was Yehudi Menuhin, the violinist, who really got it. And he wrote, after he came back to England, he wrote me like a 5-page letter. I'm sorry I don't have, on the subject. And then he volunteered to give a recital for us in Jerusalem, which must have shocked a lot of people. You know, why would Menuhin? Sometimes these people were called Schwarzes. Why would he come and give a concert for the Schwarzes? You know, but he did, and it was a huge success in the big hall in Jerusalem, the Binyanei Huma. So that was going very well, and I thought I was doing valuable work. And one way I knew it was valuable work is one day I received a call from someone called Max Nurok, who was the uncle actually of a girl I'd known at Oxford. But he had recently retired, come back from being Israel ambassador to Australia, and he was now in the Israeli Foreign Office as the head of publications. So he invited me to the pension where he lived for an English tea. It was very gentle. And we had all sorts of little chats. And then he said, well, you know, I'm going to retire soon. And I'm looking for someone to take over my job. Would you be interested? He said, it comes with ambassadorial rank. I was 24, I think. Comes with ambassadorial rank. So I at once said, yeah, that sounds great. I'd be happy to do that. I feel I could also do some service for the country and so on. And it wouldn't conflict, I said, with what I'm doing now, because I can always do that in the evening, you know, on my own time. He said, no, you don't understand. I said, I do, Max, I do understand. And that would be my condition, that you allow me to do this other stuff. He said, well, I don't think that would work. And I said, I don't think it would work either. And so I left. But that told me, I mean, if they're going to try to bribe me with an ambassadorial rank and all that kind of crap, what I was doing must be really having an effect. Anyway, So the Sephardim decided it's time for them to send me to America. Go to America, spread the word in America, and also raise money in America. And so I went to America. I was very good at spreading the word. I went to all sorts of university campuses and this, that, and the other, all over the country. But I didn't raise a penny. I never knew how to ask for money. So after a while, they called me. They wrote to me from Jerusalem and said, do you think you can raise money? I said, I'm really not sure I can. They said, well, we had an offer from the Jewish Agency, which was the executive branch of the World Zionist Organization, that they would give us a seat on their board if we drop you. I said, go ahead. No hard feelings. I think I want to stay in America anyway. But I said, I'll take this as a compliment to the work I've done, that for the first time ever, they have a non-Ashkenazi on the board of the Jewish Agency. So that was that. Then I stayed in America. And I worked for a while with a defunct organization called the American Council of Judaism, which was known as like an anti-Zionist, assimilationist organization, all the bad things. But in fact, from my point of view, it was this comprised of two things. One was people who really wanted to assimilate and who objected to Israel because Israel compromised their status as American citizens. And I didn't give a damn about that. The other half of the organization, including, by the way, Yehudi Menuhin's father, Moshe Menuhin, was made of people who, on Jewish grounds, not necessarily Jewish religious grounds, but on Jewish grounds, didn't believe that this is what we, the Jews, should be doing. I mean, you can disagree with it, but it's a legitimate case. And that was the half of the organization to which I felt attached. But anyway,
in what ways, what were the particular sort of ideas and thoughts that were being sort of pursued?
Well, at the core of it is the question, how are we as Jews different from everyone else? What does it mean that we're the Am Sgula, the chosen people? What is this privilege, this burden that we carry that distinguishes us from everyone else? And the traditional answer, of course, is God is our king. And there are plenty of references in the Bible to that. God is our king. And so if God is our king, who is Charles III, for God's sake? You know, we are not a political entity, except insofar as our political being is in servitude to God. Now, I don't expect you to agree with it or anything like that, but that's the essence of it. As Gideon said to the elders of Israel when they asked him to be king, I will not be your king, my sons will not be your king, God is our king. So it's a zero-sum game. You can't have two kings. And that's a theme that recurs quite a lot. And I actually wrote a book about it, which I call this theomonarchism. This is the only term I've ever coined in my life. Theomonarchism. So I have a little book documented in the Bible. Theomonarchism in the biblical text is my book. So that was the essence of it. That the encroachment of political considerations and objectives and so on, politics is essentially corrupt. It's essentially dishonest. It's all sorts of negative things. And we've survived 2,000 years without having our own country. It's been difficult. It's been very hard at times. But having your own country, think of October the 7th. Having your own country doesn't guarantee that you're not going to have tragedies as well. And then the other point I would make is that Jews have had several experiments in sovereignty. Kingdom of Jerusalem, of Israel, Kingdom of Judea, the Second Commonwealth. They've never lasted. They've never lasted. I hope Israel lasts forever, but it's in the course, just as from a purely Jewish historical standpoint, it may not, if it follows in the Jewish custom. It's like if you've been divorced 4 times and you get married again, you say, "Oh, this is my last time." Well, maybe it is. I hope it is. But, the momentum goes in the other direction. So it was that kind of point of view. And I published a book then called Zionism Reconsidered, which was a reader of about 10 or 12 different people's writings, published writings. Everyone from Philip Roth to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the works, in which on Jewish grounds they opposed the idea of Jewish life being based on political on a political sovereignty. So that I hope that answers your question.
I was going to ask you this later, but now we're talking. Where do you? So do you, or does this reconcile with a sense of you mentioned the support for Israel, but a kind of a critique, a kind of a fundamental critique of the political state, the Jewish political.
I think my answer to that is Sisyphus. Sisyphus kept on pushing that boulder up the mountain, right? And every time he got near the top, it just rolled back again. And I think that to be realistic, you must never say, "I got the boulder to the top," and kid yourself, which I think a lot of people attached to Israel do. I think you have to say, well, this is what we have to keep on trying. We have to keep on trying. It's when I was a kid, one of the songs that really got to me at Woodstock, I learned, "The bear went over the mountain." You remember that song? When he gets to the top of the mountain, he sees another mountain. What does he do? He climbs another. And it's an endless progression. And maybe that's our destiny, that we can't deny these imperatives, but they can't be the only imperatives that guide our lives, because, hey, I don't want a whole bunch of filthy Arabs coming in and raping and beheading my children and all that kind of thing. So, it's all very well saying God will protect you, but maybe the way God protects you is by putting a gun in your hand. But then when you have the gun in your hand, don't pretend that you fulfilled all the imperatives of Jewish existence, because you haven't. The boulder, putting that gun in your hand is like having the boulder roll down again. But you have no alternative. The boulder will roll down. And if you don't have that gun in your head, you're dead. So it's an ambiguous answer, but I think that's a realistic one. I want to just tell you, divert. At a certain stage in my life, yes, after this whole Jewish organization collapsed, I decided time for me to sort of put my money where my mouth is, because I'd read all sort of Gandhi stuff and Ruskin and Tolstoy and so on. I said, I'm going to go and join a commune. So I joined a commune in New Hampshire. It was called Hidden Springs, a very commune name. And it was a great commune, but we didn't do drugs, and there were other things we didn't do. And I had a car, and I would sometimes go to New York and give lectures, because we needed money, and this was one way of bringing in money. So I was driving down in my old car outside Hartford, and my car broke down. And I barely managed to get it to the side of the road. And I tried to get it. I didn't know what to do. I don't know about cars. It wouldn't start. So I thought, well, it's a busy highway. Someone will stop and help me. We didn't have cell phones in those days. Someone will help me. No one did. And I thought, I'm going to sit on this embankment until I starve to death and, the worms eat my flesh. This is where I could be forever and ever, ever. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw this blue light flashing, and a police car pulled up behind me. And this policeman got out, a very, very nice young man. And he said, well, do you know what the trouble is? I said, no, I don't know how to fix cars. He said, I'll call a wrecker for you. He'll come and tow you away, and he'll fix your car. And you can go with him while he fixes the car, whatever. And he did that, and we chatted. He was a lovely guy. We chatted and so on, and then he went on his way. And I thought, here I am, my hippie self, all against authority and, police are pigs, all that kind of stuff. And yet the only one who would help me was a policeman. And that was also a bit of an epiphany for me. It forced me to rethink many things, that silly little episode. But it was a kind of Jewish episode as well. That, don't be too extreme.
It's interesting you mentioned, I assume this was late 60s, this film?
This would have been about 68, 69.
So you mentioned earlier you were kind of, from reading Hannah Arendt and being done with liberalism. Was where were you in, you're thinking about the world and things at this time in sort of 68?
Well, I was a purist. But when my car broke down, I didn't want to be a purist. On October 7th, I wouldn't have wanted to be a purist either. Shoot me. I love you, brother. I don't believe in violence. That's not good. That's not good. Yeah. Can I get back to the narrative? I decided after my hippie days were over, I decided I was going to get a PhD and teach at university. For want of anything better. So I thought, well, I'll get a PhD. And I had some very interesting correspondence from my Israel days with David Reisman, if you remember David Reisman, one of the great sociologists, with Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Nahum Glaser. They were the triumvirate at Harvard. And Reisman really liked me. And I thought, well, I'll get Reisman, tell him I want to go to Harvard. Will he get me in? He would have gotten me in. But this was like in November or something. I'd have had to wait a whole year. So the City University of New York had just opened up its graduate school. So I said, I don't care where I get a PhD from. It's just instrumental. So I went there and knocked at the door of the history department. And the chairman of the history department was there, and I introduced me. He said, are you the guy who wrote that book about Israel? I said, yeah. Well, he said, you might as well walk out of the door again, because there's no way I'll let you into my department. Thought that's a good scholarly attitude. So I thanked him. Next door was political science. I didn't know what the hell political science really was. And I'm still shocked when I think about what nonsense it is. But I knocked on their door, and the guy, and he heard Oxford. There was not enough he could do for me. So free tuition, research assistance, my own office, lots of money. And then I said, well, what degree you have? I said, I have an MA from Oxford. He said, oh, well, we'll give you, it's not in political science, so we can't give you all. We'll give you 50 credits for that. I don't know if you know what an Oxford MA is. It's nothing. You get your BA, and like 4 years later, you pay £10, and that's how you get your MA. And you don't do anything. It's an old medieval thing. You were a journeyman for 4 years. So he gave me credits for my Oxford MA, which I still think is hilarious. Anyway, so I started doing my doctorate, and then I decided that then the time came to dissertation. And by this time, I was very friendly with it.
Sorry, can we take a quick technical break again?
Sure.
Sorry to interrupt. We'll come right back.
I'm rolling.
Okay, so now I was at graduate school, and the time had come to do my doctoral dissertation. And I had become quite friendly with a woman called Susanna Morgenthau, whose father was Hans Morgenthau. I mean, we were never romantically involved, but you know, we were good friends. And through her, I got to know Hans Morgenthau, who had left the University of Chicago and was now at the same City University of New York Graduate Center as I was. And I decided I would do my dissertation with him. And what was my dissertation going to be? Well, for a long time, I'd been really, really, really intrigued by what I always thought was one of the sleazier episodes in 20th century Jewish history, namely the reparations agreement between Germany and Israel. And I thought, I'm going to do my dissertation on what really went on in that agreement. And the reason this was such an issue is this. A large number of Jews died without heirs. And then the question is, what becomes of their assets? Under the normal course of things, it escheats to the state. But for those assets to escheat to the state to the Federal Republic of Germany is obviously unacceptable. So to whom does that money, do those assets belong? And the Israeli government says, it's simple, we're the state of the Jews. We speak for all Jews, which had been the claim of the Zionist organization when, in fact, at a time in the 1890s when they spoke for 300 Jews. I mean, they always said, you know, all Jews belong to the Jewish nation, and we're the embodiment, the sovereign embodiment, once it became Israel, of the state of Israel. Well, you know, that was their aspiration. It wasn't a fact. It wasn't a fact recognized by any other country or in international law. But the Israelis said the assets of heirless Jewish property belongs to us. And the Germans, eager as they were to be liked, nevertheless said, nah, that doesn't wash. You don't speak for everyone. So what the Israelis did was they set up a front organization in which Israeli participation and control were not evident, and which they claim now would speak for all Jews in the world. So they got all sorts of Jewish organizations, most of which were their own front organizations, to become members of what was called the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, the Claims Conference. And the Germans said, well, thank you, now we can give you the money with a clear conscience, because we're not giving it to you, we're giving it to all of the Jewry, which is what our mandate is. And of course, I mean, I knew that that was nonsense. I knew that the Claims Conference did not represent all Jews, and that those organizations that made it up didn't represent very much more.
How did you know that?
You just know it. Like, take the American Jewish Committee. You know, the American Jewish Committee has, what, 2,000 or 3,000 members, gets all of its money from them. There's no election. There's no legitimate representative. Or the Anti-Defamation League. All these things, I speak for everyone. And who's going to bother to challenge that? So I knew that my dissertation hinged on my finding one document. And that document would be the agreement between the state of Israel, the government of Israel, and the Claims Conference, in which the Claims Conference acknowledged that basically everything we do is for the state of Israel, and all the decisions we make are cleared through you, and all the money that flows to us will flow through you first. And some of this was overt. For instance, in the negotiations, the Luxembourg Agreement with the Germans, the Claims Conference, which was the other party to the thing, agreed that all the money paid out by the Germans would be paid to Israel, and that Israel would then pay it to the Claims Conference, which was bullshit. I mean, there's no reason why Germany couldn't do it directly, but it was one of the ways in which the theory that Israel is the sovereign state would work, that the Claims Conference would be the beneficiary, not of the German government, but of the Israeli government. But there had to be a document which set forth all of this. And there are books of documents of the reparations agreement, all of the documents from the Germans, from the Israelis. That no mention ever in any of these documents, of these collections of documents, of this document. But I knew it was there. So I thought, in a way, sort of Occam's razor. What's the simplest way of getting a document? You just go and ask for it. So the office of the Claims Conference was on Park Avenue South in New York. I called up and asked, when is the executive director going to be in? I said, he goes out for lunch. He'll be back by 2. So I made a point of being there well before 2. I went to the receptionist. I said, could you ask the archivist to give me a copy of this document? Knowing that the executive director wasn't around to be consulted. So she said, sure. And like 10 minutes later, I had this document in my hand. And it was a great coup. I felt really pleased with myself. So I wrote this up as a whole dissertation. And in those days, one page of Xerox was 25 cents. And I was an impoverished graduate student. So I didn't make a Xerox copy, and I didn't make carbon copies. I hate carbon copies. So I just had this one copy. I wrote the dissertation. I gave it to Morgenthau. And about 2 weeks later, his daughter called me and said, my father feels so bad, but he's lost your dissertation. I said he didn't lose it. He didn't want to be associated with it because it's so explosive. And here's a man who made his career on the phrase of speaking truth to power. When it comes to really speaking truth to power, he loses it. So that was the end of that. But I still had the document, the original one that they'd given me. So only about 4 or 5 years ago, I wrote a book about it called The Reparations Agreement, in which for the first time, this document was published. And I think that has some value. Because, Israel still has hundreds of millions of dollars pouring into it and the people in New York and in Israel, the survivors, are living in poverty. I mean, New York State recently published a study of they live on less than welfare people do. All those billions are in bullshit organizations like the ADL or Yad Vashem or whatever. They don't go to the people for whom they were intended. So I feel strongly about that. It's a squalid story. Anyway, so Morgenthau lost my dissertation, so I had to sit down and write another one. So I decided totally different. I decided to write a dissertation about the identity quest. And here we come back. The identity quest of 2 incredibly interesting and transparent figures, Mahatma Gandhi and Benjamin Disraeli. What did they have in common? Disraeli's father, who of course was a Jew, hated being a Jew, was an anti-Semite, had his children converted, but was always writing anti-Jewish things. He wrote a novel in which kind of the main figure is like stereotype anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, and so on. And this was the cauldron in which young Benjamin Disraeli had to live. And then one day, and he has a whole novel about this, he discovered how great his identity really is. This novel is called Contarini Fleming, and it's set in Venice, and it's a Venetian discovering how great his family is. But this is obviously, it's transparently, and Disraeli acknowledged it, autobiographical. And instead of cringing and being shaped, Disraeli became the most flamboyant and defiant and in-your-face Jew that England has ever seen. Once, for instance, an Irish member of Parliament made a sort of anti-Semitic speech in Parliament, and Disraeli, when he finished, got up and said, you know, when your ancestors were living in caves and eating raw meat, my ancestors were communing with God and writing sublime poetry. You know, that was typical Disraeli stuff. In your face, no apologies. If anything, we are superior to you, and you should be grateful that you have us in our presence. So that transformation, the psychology of it, is even more apparent in the case of Gandhi. You know, you think of Gandhi as quintessential Indian, you know, his dhoti, the man whom Churchill derided as a half-naked fakir. Gandhi spent his youth in the world that Macaulay had created, the world in which, if you are an Indian, we're going to make you white and all but the color of your skin. And at a certain stage, he decided he was going to study law, and he would do so in London. But his main reason for wanting to go to London, to Britain, was so he could learn, as he put it in his autobiography, to ape the manners of the English gentleman. This is our Gandhi. So he goes to London, he goes to Savile Row, gets, you know, top coats and cravats and top hats. He takes lessons in elocution, not that had helped. He took lessons in ballroom dancing. This is our Mahatma. And then eventually, having got his law thing, he goes to South Africa. And as a gentleman, he has, you know, a gold sovereign in his pocket, and he uses it to buy a first-class railway ticket to get to Pretoria. And he's in the train. He's in the train when an Englishman gets into the compartment. And he says, "You're not allowed to ride here. I bought a ticket," shows him his ticket. Guy pulls the chain, whatever, the guards come and says, "This man's not allowed in here." They throw him out of the train with his baggage onto the platform. The train pulls away. And this was Gandhi's moment when he realized he's not English. He doesn't want to be English. He's Indian. And this is a moment when the Mahatma is born. If you will, like me, not that I'm a Mahatma, me with a Nawab's tree. This is the moment. This is the moment of epiphany. And from now on, he becomes a real Indian. Forget the clothes, forget the gold sovereigns, etc., etc., etc. So this was my dissertation, and it was reasonably well accepted. So when I was doing my research on this dissertation,
where was the dissertation?
Pardon?
From which university?
This City University of New York. Garbage. So I got a grant to go to England to, I'm blocked on the name, to Disraeli's country home. I wanted to breathe the air, you know. And I was looking around, came to his study, his desk, his chair, and I asked the woman who was in charge of the place, said, "I know this is silly, but could I sit at his desk? Because I'm writing a biography of him. I want to read." She said, "Oh, if you must, you must." So I sat at his desk, and there was a bookcase opposite him, you know, with molding at the top of the bookcase, and sticking up above the molding, there were papers. So I called the woman. I said, "What are those papers?" "Oh," she said, "if they're up there, they're nothing." I said, "I really want to see them." So very reluctantly, she got some kind of maintenance guy to bring a step ladder, got up there. There were, I think, 7 or 8 books. They were all textbooks. They were all Disraeli's textbooks from when he was a kid, and some of them had been his father's, when his father was a kid, and that Disraeli was using. And in many of them, there were endless numbers of doodles by Benjamin. Now, doodles are often very rich in psychological material. And I couldn't believe it. Here I was interested in Disraeli psychology, right? And here, for the first time ever, someone was seeing all this fantastic material. So I had it photographed. And then I took these photographs to a friend of this Susan Morgenthal's, Hansler's daughter, a woman called Florence Miali, who lived just down the road from me. And Florence Miali was one of the oddest characters. She was about this tall. She was about this wide. Her face was pockmarked. She was a chain smoker. And she's one of the most brilliant people I've ever known in my life. She had like a command of the English language, a sensitivity to words. She was a psychotherapist, but she'd also written quite a few books on psychological testing techniques, like the Rorschach and so on. So I showed her these drawings. And she was fantastic. She was fantastic. And then I decided to show them to 5 or 6 other psychologists, just to, so it wasn't just one person's view. And there was a broad consensus as to what these drawings showed about the person, which was very close to what I'd been assuming, but validated in a way what I was saying. So I was very excited about that. And then Florence mentioned, just like off the cuff, that she has the Rorschach, you know what the Rorschach, the ink blot test. She has the Rorschach records of all the major Nazi war criminals who were tried at Nuremberg. I couldn't believe it. I mean, talk about primary source material. They'd never been published. No one had ever done anything about it. She'd used them in some of her classes. So I said, listen, can we work on this together? Anyway, what ended up was that for about 8 or 9 months, I went pretty much every day, and we worked over these Rorschachs. She would do this psychological interpreting, and I would see how it fitted in to their lives, their careers, what we knew from other sources. And we wrote a book. It was called The Nuremberg Mind. And it was very controversial because the usual suspects, the liberals, said, no, that's nonsense. They were just obeying the Fuhrer, kind of argument. But it's still a good book, I think.
What were its conclusions?
Well, in a word, psychopaths. To put it all in one word, psychopaths. And it was then that I got, as I mentioned earlier, Eichmann's drawings. And again, I went to Florence and the others, and I did some publishing on that. So that was a phase in my career which took me back to the Nazis. And then we were coming up to 1976, the bicentennial year. And I thought, I want to write a book which, in my own totally unimportant way, is kind of a tribute to this grand country in which I'm living. And so I thought I would write a book about the day on which Dachau was liberated by American troops. And I did that. I found soldiers who'd been involved in the liberation, and I found people who'd been prisoners in the camp at the time of its liberation. And I wrote a book. It was called Deliverance Day. It's actually the crappiest book I've written, and I've written crappy books. It's not a good book, but it won something called the National Jewish Book Award, which at least sort of tickled my children. It's not a good book, but it was like I was doing this, and I chose Dachau in a way because Dachau didn't have many Jews in it. I didn't want this to be a Jewish book because it's easy enough to say the Nazis killed Jews. The rest of them didn't. But Dachau was basically, a lot of Jews died there, but wasn't primarily Jewish. then on the basis of the Eichmann article in the New York Times, I had an agent then at William Morris, and he contacted Playboy magazine and said, you know, Michael has this unusual way of interviewing people. So would you be interested? So, oh, I know what happened. One of the people I'd interviewed, one of the people in the Nuremberg Mind book was Albert Speer. And Eric Fromm, if you remember Eric Fromm, and Hugh Trevor Roper really took us to task, said, you got Speer all wrong. Speer's a decent guy. And that's not what our Rorschach showed. So I thought, well, next time I'm in Europe, I'm going to go and interview Speer and see how accurate Florence's interpretation of his Rorschach is. And that's what I did. I went to Germany. I interviewed this awful, awful man. I mean, one of those charming psychopaths, rather than, you know, and it was astonishing. I wrote a long article which a Playboy in Spain published for some reason. And that led to Playboy in Germany asking if I'd be interested in doing more interviews along those lines, these kind of psychological intake reviews. So I said, well, I didn't want to do anything with any of the Germans. So I told my agent, ask them an inordinate amount of money. And they agreed. And I said, well, tell them I want to travel any way I want. So I was flying across the Atlantic in the Concorde, for goodness sake. You know, they were just so eager to please the Jew. But I said the real test will be if they agree to my first article, which will be on Leni Riefenstahl. You remember Leni Riefenstahl, Hitler's beauty. So I said, oh, sure, she's an interesting woman. So I went to Munich, where she lived, and I interviewed her, and I wrote an article about her. She was, I mean, talk about a disgusting person. I mean, she was really nightmarish. And I sent it to them. And then I had some other interviews. I was doing, for instance, Peter Ustinov was one I did. And then I went to India to do Indira Gandhi. Except when I got there, there was a letter waiting for me at the gatehouse. I don't want to be interviewed by you. I mean, she'd agreed to it, and I had to fly all the way there. But anyway, so the Playboy thing was unraveling. But then when I got back from Indira, there was this message: we're not going to publish your article on Leni Riefenstahl. It's too anti-German. I said, this is really interesting. So it means you identify German with Nazi. Is that still true? So we got into a whole thing. Finally, I just walked away. So that was the end of my gallivanting on the Concorde and so on. But I was astounded that these Germans were still standing by the Nazis.
Let's take a short break there for another technical break.
Okay. And we're rolling.
You know, almost everything I've written, and I'm sure this is a character defect, has been kind of confrontational. Thomas Carlyle, in the 19th century, in his book on heroes and hero worship, makes the point that you can tell a lot about a person by knowing who his heroes are. Well, from a very early age, I've really had one hero. And my one hero was that little boy in Hans Christian Andersen's story who said the emperor is naked. You know that story. Everyone knows that story. And I always thought, that's whom I really admire. And that's who, it's not even that's who I want to be, it's that's who I am. I think of the world as being so full of bullshit, so full of posturing, so full of lies, so full of people pursuing their agendas at the expense of decency and honesty, people so ready to be kidded by false prophets, etc., that I don't claim this is a moral virtue at all. It's a character defect, or it's a character trait, but we're verging on the defect. And so much of that has shaped all the stuff that I write, and so much of that has shaped what I think. One of the great things about an English education, it used to be the case, but it's not anymore, and not about American education, is that you were really taught not to take anyone's statement as the truth. If someone said something 2 + 2 before, you would want to confirm that for yourself. And I think that's a wonderful, wonderful thing, which I think, by the way, finds its way into the Jewish culture as well, because after all, what are the Talmuds and all the other things? People arguing over things. You say this, but I say that. No, that's not what it says. Yes, it is. And that constant dialectic of confrontation, of not taking people's word for it, or if you're inclined to, then not being sure that you really know what they're saying, and so on. Getting into that. That's not an American education. To an American education, you have to know what's in a textbook. But that was not what our education was, not at Bedales, and certainly not at Oxford. And that's very deeply ingrained in me, I think. I don't claim it as a virtue, I just claim it as a trait. And so a lot of stuff that I've written, a lot of stuff that has always been, the Emperor's Naked.
Can I ask? I wanted to ask. There's a couple more of your books that I wanted to ask you about. But before that, you mentioned to me on the phone you had some time teaching college at the university. Can you
yeah. So I got my doctorate, and then I got a job in one of the branches of the City University of New York called Brooklyn College. And what an out-of-body experience that was. Not my idea of a college, but anyway, I was happy I had a job. I had a family I had to support, so I was able to get salary. And I really enjoyed my work, my research work. I didn't particularly enjoy the teaching. I enjoyed my research work a great deal. So now what happened at a certain time was that I had a sister. She had a husband. Her husband had a PhD in political science, but he didn't have a job. I mean, he had several jobs, but never got tenure. So the chairman of the department in Brooklyn was a friend of mine. I said, can't you do something for him? So he gave this guy a job. And his job started at the same time as my job as a full-time professor, which meant in turn that we were coming up for tenure at the same time. And that same time was the year in which New York City was in a huge financial crisis. And so it wasn't clear even if one person would get tenure, but it was certain that two people wouldn't. So it assumed only one person would get it. Now, I don't want to sound boastful, but the department was so mediocre that at that stage, I had more publications and more research grants than the whole department put together. And that's not testimony from me, but it's a comment on them. And this brother-in-law of mine had nothing. He had no publications, no research grants. And so it was obvious that if anyone's going to get tenure, it would be I. And he knew that. And his wife knew that. So they decided to sabotage me so that he could get the tenure. And the way they sabotaged me was by going to the college personnel committee when I was brought in to interview ostensibly for my tenure, by saying that I was working for the CIA. Bizarre. I wasn't working for the CIA. Well, I mean, you know, are you going to disprove that? I mean, this is Kafka. How do you prove that you're not working for the CIA? Well, I took the position. I said, yeah, I don't see any problem with the CIA. It's an important agency of the American government. And I can't imagine country being without it, but I'm not going to, you know. So anyway, they fired me. And he got tenure. So I knew a great law firm. I went to them, and they said, "Okay, we'll represent you for free, pro bono," which they did, and we won the case, and so on. And then they asked me if, instead of taking the money I'd been awarded, whether I would go back and teach there again. I said, you know, I can't tell you no. So that's when I started doing a lot of freelance writing, these books and these articles and so on. And but the time came when I just couldn't anymore. I had this writer's block. I think a lot of the drive that was in my sort of confrontational attitude, confrontational use of writing, I think it just created big blocks. I was just, my life was too high strung. And confrontation is important, but you've got to have something else as well. So I didn't know what to do. No other university would hire me. You know, who wants to have a CIA person? I mean, if you've been in the Brotherhood of Islam or something, you know, or the Muslim Brotherhood, that would be fine. But CIA, no. So I didn't know what to do, and I couldn't write. I gave some lectures, but that dried up. So then I remembered old Murph the Surf. If you remember, was one of the great bank robbers of all time. And at a press conference once, he was trotted out by the cops. The press conference, some journalist said, "Well, Murph, why are you always robbing banks?" And Murph said, "What a brilliant guy. He could have been my friend." Murph said, "Because that's where the money is." So that's true. Thank you, Murph. So I went down to Wall Street to see if I could get a job. And a lot of people, I mean, Goldman Sachs offered me a job researching municipal bonds. I said, I don't want to research. I want to be on the firing line. I want to buy and sell and make oodles of money. And I ended up at Lehman Brothers, which in those days was a small private firm, pretty much on a par with Goldman Sachs. And I had an interview with this brilliant guy called Bill Welch, who was the senior partner in charge of that. He said, "Well, why do you want to come to Lehman Brothers?" And I said, "I've got to show this guy what a good salesman I am." I said, "You know, Bill, at Oxford, I went to Balliol College because it was the best college in Oxford. Lehman Brothers is the Balliol of Wall Street." Oh boy, did he lap that up. He said, "Can you start tomorrow?" kind of thing. So yes, I was there, and I was pretty successful. After 2 years, I reached the senior vice president level. Then a number of us were bought out from Lehman to another big firm whose name I've blocked right now. And we all went there with a lot of money more, and we were all managing directors and so on. But there was no fit because their model was not compatible with the Lehman ones. So they asked us to leave, and we said, "We'll leave, but we're taking our money with us." So we did. And that's when I said goodbye to Wall Street. And, you know, I hated Wall Street. That's not, I mean, I'm not a stockbroker. And I was not seeing my children. I'd leave at about 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning from Montclair, New Jersey, drive to Wall Street, come back home at night. They would or sleep. I'd see them on weekends. So we then moved up into the Berkshires, which is a lovely area in the western Massachusetts, and in the town of Great Barrington. Bought a little country store. Thought this would be a nice, relaxing life. I can read, write, and sell people, you know, toothpicks or whatever they want to buy. But eventually, that store morphed into an army surplus store because people weren't buying toothpicks anymore. Actually, we were selling mainly stationery, but then big corporate, even pre-internet, this all became monopolized. So we started selling. A strange story. We started selling military surplus clothing, and a lot of college kids and so on out there in the Berkshires. And boy, did they lap it up! And we sold real surplus clothing, not Banana Republic kind of stuff, and it was amazingly successful and profitable. But then what happened? All of a sudden, there was no more military surplus. The warehouses had been emptied. We were selling stuff from Sweden and from Brazil and so on. I wouldn't sell German stuff. We could have always sold more. I didn't want to sell German stuff. But all of a sudden, there's no more military surplus. So I thought, well, okay, it's time. So I began selling rare books. And I had quite a few to start with of my own. And there were a few I didn't want to sell, but I used that as base. Anyway, very quickly, we did pretty well. I developed one or two techniques no one had ever thought of in terms of selling rare books and so on. And then we hit a problem because my main customers were rare book libraries in universities. And all of a sudden, this would be about 94, 95, they stopped buying them because the geniuses who were now leading universities said, there's nothing in it. Why should we have these books? No one ever reads them. So instead of buying books, they started to sell them, which put a big dent in. But then the internet came along. And I hated going to book fairs. And I thought, maybe we can use the internet to sell old, used, and rare books. So we set up a company called BiblioFind. And boy, did we have a difficult time of it, because in those days, software was really useless. And there were very few programmers around. And most of them who were around were absolutely no good at all. It was a nightmare. And we had this message to come. If you see this message, please call such and such number. In the middle of the night, I was getting messages from Tokyo and so on. Yeah, I see your blue screen. Oh, thanks. So it was horrible. But we managed to get through it all. We managed to get through it all, and we sold the company in 99. And we were very successful. We had about 10,000 booksellers on the, and they were paying us very little. They were paying $10 each. But $10 at 10,000 is 100,000 a month. And we're working out of our living room. Our overheads were almost nothing. But when Amazon acquired it, they had to have 30 people working on it and this, that, and the other. And they screwed up and it collapsed. So that was, they incorporated into BiblioFind, into Amazon. But anyway, so I was really, really, you have no idea how relieved I was to be. I don't know anything about programming. I don't know anything about computers. So that was great. We had got rid of BiblioFind. We had a decent amount of money in our pockets. So I know we bought a wonderful house in Arizona, kept a house in Berkshires, commuted twice a year. And I did various things, none of them very successful. I tried to start a new website. It was called the Memory Gym, where you'd go to the Memory Gym and you'd do all sorts of memory exercises. And it was beautifully done. You'd come in, you'd park your car. And at the end of the exercise, you'd go back to the parking lot and try to find your car. But the green car that we were next to was no longer there. There was a yellow truck or whatever, So it was wonderful, but it didn't work. No one was the site worked, no one was interested. So I gave that up. And I just began writing books again. I spent about 7 years writing a book on symmetry. And I think that's a good book. It's called Symmetry Fallacies. And then a few years later, I wrote a book about symmetry in Byzantine art, the concept of symmetry in Byzantine art. And I wrote Jewish books, and this, that, and the other. And that's pretty much where I am now.
Can I ask you about one of your early books? I don't know if it's your first, because I probably don't have a full bibliography in front of me, but you had a book with a provocative title that you mentioned to me before, the Aryanization
Yeah.
of the Jewish state. I'm wondering if you could talk about the ideas in the book and the reception of those ideas.
First of all, I feel very defensive about the title. It was a stupid title. It was an attention-grabbing title. It was actually an insulting title. But I was 24, 25 and didn't know better. About 2 years ago, I brought out a new edition of the book, and it now has the title Negating the Diaspora, which is lower key and much more to the point. You want to know what the book was about? The book was about the treatment of Jews from the Muslim world by Jews from the non-Muslim world in Israel, so-called ethnic tensions or whatever you want to call it. It documented that treatment. And that was important because very often, I mean, I interviewed everyone in Israel from Ben Gurion on down, and they all said, Ein shum bayah, there's no problem. Give it another generation or two, it'll all pass, you know, that kind of crap. But it was important to document this. So in this book, I documented the dimensions, the existence of the dimensions, the attitudinal as well as the behavioral, prejudice and discrimination. But I went much further and much deeper and much more threateningly into why does this problem exist? And this is my answer. In the 19th century, in Eastern Europe, they developed this whole class of Jews called the Maskilim, the enlightened ones. And the Maskilim were basically Westernizers. But it wasn't enough that they were attracted to Western culture. What they also felt very strongly and without inhibition was how disgusting the Jews in Eastern Europe are. If you want, you know, anti-Semitism, you read the novels of the Maskilim, and it's just appalling. They hated everything Jewish about the East European Jews, and they wanted to refashion the Jew away from the yeshiva bocher to, if you will, Ari ben Canaan as played by Paul Newman, if you ever saw that movie Exodus. In order to complete their rejection of the Jewishness and to fulfill their adoption of the Western thing, there was one thing they had to have, and that was a state of their own. So my argument was that the impulse to create the state of Israel is essentially an assimilationist one. For all the national anthem, for 2,000 years we've wanted it and so on. It was an assimilationist impulse. We should not say that other elements weren't in there, like the historical one, the nationalist one, and so on. It was, and if you doubt that, the most remarkable book of the early Zionist movement was one by its founder, Theodor Herzl, and was called Alt Neuland, Old New Land. And people think of it as a utopian novel. I think of it as a dystopian novel because it describes the state that the Zionist movement is going to, it's a novel, the state that the Zionist movement is going to bring into being. And I challenge you in this whole book, and it's a fairly long book, to find even 2 or 3 references that are in any way Jewish. People there don't speak Hebrew, they don't go to synagogues, no kashrut, nothing, there's nothing. It's all, our department stores are as fine as the greatest ones in Paris. Our opera beats La Scala, it's all of this kind of thing. Nothing Jewish about it. I'm not the only person who said, for instance, Achad Ha'am, who was a kind of conservative Zionist, was appalled by it. But this became really like the handbook of Zionist fantasies. A state where everyone walking down the road is blonde-haired and blue-eyed. And by the way, talking about that, and I mentioned this book, it used to be, I don't know if it's still the case, on Independence Day in Israel and so on, when you have soldiers marching by, and then you have the girl soldiers. And if you look carefully, on the front row and on the sides, on the outsides, almost all the girls are blonde haired. And it's not an accident, it's intentional. And there's a lot of this blonde haired stuff going on in Israel. So that was it. If that's what they wanted, that's what they got. Except then, around 1948, disaster struck. Why did it strike? Because the Muslim countries, appalled by the establishment of a Jewish state, said, we don't want these Jews living here anymore. And Iraq in particular had its pogroms in the 1940s and so on. And so there was a huge upheaval. About 800,000, no one is exact, refugees poured in. And these refugees, for the most part, were the worst dream, the worst nightmare that the East European Jews ever had, because they were Asiatics, which is exactly what the anti-Semites and the Maskilim said the Jews were. They're ignorant, they're dirty, they eat with their mouths open. I mean, they're ignorant, whatever. They're just appalling, and that's where they're there. And so you have this huge outpouring of establishment of institutionalized discrimination, of uninhibited prejudice, and then the complete denial of it, and therefore the complete inability to address constructively all of this. And this is what my book aimed at. And the leading Jewish magazine in America in those days was Commentary, an intellectual magazine. And I can't remember the name of the guy, whatever. He got a guy in Israel to review my book. And this guy in Israel is a real hack. And it was one of the longest reviews ever published in Commentary. And it's like pages out of Sturmer. He actually compared me to the John Birch Society. And just went on and on and on and on and on. In my new edition, I have a whole chapter addressing him. Because I sent a reply to Commentary, they didn't publish it. Norman Podhoretz was the editor. They wouldn't publish my reply. But very few people other than Arab propagandists paid attention to my book. And I wasn't happy about that. But in the last 20 or 25 years, that's changed. A lot of people, I mean, my book is cited in so many places by sociologists, by polemicists, and so on. And it's quite highly thought of. Because although at the time everyone says, no, it'll all disappear in a generation, the problem will be solved, there are now people saying the problem has not been solved, the problem is still here. So that's that. I just regret that title.
Do you think things have changed in Israel at all in relation to Sephardic Mizrahi?
No, I think the Mizrahim have become more aggressive, have become more visible, have become less apologetic. For instance, a lot of popular music in Israel when I lived there was straight out of the steppes of Russia, well, Eastern European kind of music. Now there's very strong Yemenite and Moroccan influence. But, if you look like things at the Supreme Court, the college faculty, it's only recently, if I'm not mistaken, that the Hebrew University even has a department of Ladino studies. Ladino is Sephardic Hebrew. No, I don't think much has changed at all. And there's still that denial. One of the arguments I make is, if you give up being so anti-Arab in your cultural thing, maybe the Arabs themselves would find it easier to deal with you. I no longer think so. I think you could put on a keffiyeh and smoke a hookah and rape 72 virgins and they still wouldn't accept you. So I think I was totally mistaken on that.
Let's take a short technical break there.
Okay. And then we can probably get to the kind of concluding part of this.
Sure.
At least it's my conclusion, what I have to say.
Okay, I'm rolling.
I had another question, again, sort of tying back to another one of your early books. There's a book, I see the title, is Israel as a Factor in Jewish-Gentile Relations in America, Observations in the Aftermath of the...
Yeah, that was a pamphlet. That was a pamphlet.
Okay. I'm just wondering, thinking about that, given that we're, recording this interview while, there's a war going on in Gaza, you've through the 73 war as well. And, possibly, am I right in thinking you were in the United States for all three of those?
Yep.
I'm just wondering if you can talk about sort of the reactions in the, you mentioned earlier the kind of uptick in anti-Semitism when you were at the time when you were in Oxford. I'm just wondering whether you noticed anything like that during the times of these three wars in the US, or what you would say in relation to the kind of broader public kind of reactions to these?
Well, the Six-Day War in 1967 was amazing because you've never seen people loving the Jews so much. Oh gosh, everyone just... They thought that Moshe Dayan, with his black eye patch and so on, they were just thrilled. I don't remember any significant amount of negativity. People were astonished that they pulled this off so quickly, so decisively. No, it was a great time to be a Jew. And I'll give you one kind of sleazy footnote on that. I came to the United States, I think, in '66. And it was fine. I really loved being here. The war erupted, and I couldn't help notice one extraordinary phenomenon. I had read that one of the things that was happening, in the looser times, the we're all brothers times of the 60s, that a lot of white women wanted to go to bed with black guys. That was a big thing in those days. After the Six-Day War, I promise you this, all these girls coming in from the Midwest and so on to the big city, they wanted to go to bed with Jewish guys. What can I tell you? So that there was a very positive response, a very positive response. And also among Jews themselves, a lot of them who'd been assimilationists and so on, all this decided to ride the wave. If these Gentiles think Israel's great, well, who am I not to think Israel's great? To be American, I've got to think that Israel's great, that kind of stuff. I don't remember very much about the 73 thing. I must have been in some kind of cloud then. I think that what we're seeing now, this is my own take, and you probably think I'm just grinding my axe. I go to, by Zoom, a class in Jewish mysticism every day, something called the Tanya, which is a Chabad text. And yesterday, the very brilliant young rabbi was talking about how stupid it was of the Israelis to employ all these people from Gaza on the kibbutzim, because they documented this person lives here, this person's away on Shabbat, all this kind of thing. And so they had first-rate intelligence on their targets. So this rabbi is saying, how stupid can you be employing these people who are going to come back and murder you? You can only do that if you delude yourself, or if you're self-interest because you need cheap labor or whatever, but you pay a huge price. I didn't want to get in a discussion, but the fact is that that's what we do in the West. We have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people from these very undesirable countries. We let them in. Often we don't even know who they are. But come a war in Israel, you have 100, 200, 300,000 people demonstrating on Whitehall in London or on the Mall in Washington. And if you look at pictures of these crowds, for instance, in Harvard, the demonstration in Harvard, 2/3 of them certainly are not Native Americans, native to America. They're the Middle Eastern people. I recently did a little study on the Rhodes Scholarships, and of 10 Rhodes Scholars from Harvard this year, not a single one is a white male. There are 3 white females. The other 7 are all Asians, and one of them is a Pakistani who is one of the leaders of that. You remember they had the 30 organizations issuing a statement at Harvard in support of Hamas. He was one of those leaders. He gets a Rhodes Scholarship. And he says that when he goes to Oxford, what he wants to study is political messaging. He wants to be a propagandist for Hamas with an Oxford degree. And all I'm saying is that this is incredibly short-sighted. The situation with this kibbutzim on the Gaza border can very easily duplicate itself here, and I think it has already. I think that this outburst of anti-Semitism largely comes from Muslims and the useful idiots on the left. But if the Muslims weren't here, you would have very little of that. That's my view, since you asked me my view. And I don't know what we can do about it. I don't know how this is all going to play itself out. But, the mayor of London is a Muslim. The Prime Minister of Scotland is a Muslim. And they don't take the middle path. They're on the dark side.
In the sense of
Islamism. Islam is a very militant religion. People, whether they want to recognize or not, Islam divides the world into 2, Darul Harb and Darul Islam. Darul Harb is the home of the sword, and Darul Islam is the home of Islam. And it is the obligation of those living in Darul Islam to take over the Darul Harb, to bring the sword to the Darul Harb until they become converted to Islam. It's a very militant religion. My parents lived in Lahore until, I think, 1969. They were the only Jews there. Muhammad Asad was gone. Vicky Noon was gone. There were no other Jews. And can you imagine that all of a sudden, out of the blue, there was this huge wave of anti-Semitism, Islamic anti-Semitism in Lahore. We can't have Jews living among us and all this kind of thing. And basically they drove my parents out. It was kind of tragic since they'd gone through that in Germany and so on. But out of the blue comes this hatred and this militancy. And I don't for a moment believe it couldn't happen here.
Do you see, you sort of mentioned you didn't necessarily have a solution for anything, but I'm wondering whether is there anything you can say solution-wise, thoughtfully about what's going on in Israel-Palestine in terms of the conflict there? Is there anything that you can take from that, or is that not how you do things?
Well, I think you make a mistake if you look for a solution. I think that largely comes, I think of Americans as this wonderful people who always assume that every problem has a solution. We who are not American in the core of our being have a different view. We think solutions are wonderful if you can get them. They can also be very dangerous if you pursue them but cannot get them. And there's this impulse, this need. If we have a problem, let's try to solve it. The best solution for some problems is to not solve them, is to live with them, to manage them, to have an overpoweringly strong military, so that your would-be enemies don't dare attack you, and so on and so on and so on. So I can see this situation in Israel and its neighbors going on a long, long time, and every now and then someone will drop out, like the so-called Abraham Accords. All of a sudden, some of these Arabs decide, it's not worth it. We'd rather make money. We'd rather have tourists, all this kind of thing. Maybe Saudi Arabia is getting there. Will the Palestinians ever? I think that the time will come when the Palestinians have no friends in the Arab world. It's not an accident that no one wants to take these Palestinians in. I mean, Egypt sure as hell doesn't want to let them in. Jordan says we've got way too many, and no one wants them. They're not a popular people. They're leeches. They're welfare bums. They're violent. They're corrupt. No one wants them. So I think the time will come when they stand alone, and at that point, possibly like the Irish, they'll just kind of more or less give up the fight, but never completely. But I think we make a mistake in saying, what we're going to do the day after Gaza and so on. You just, a day at a time, but always be really strong. And unlike this time around, the Israelis are always really strong, but they were totally incompetent. This October 7th should never have happened. And we know that there was intelligence warning about it beforehand. Should never have happened. The Israelis got smug.
You said earlier, when you're talking about your sort of beliefs and they've evolved over time, you can move away from liberalism. And I might be misunderstanding, but I think you said it was something like you have the concept of original sin, and you were addressing the issue, excuse me, of what makes people evil. What would you say about that?
What makes people evil? I've just finished writing a little book about the creation narratives of the book of Genesis. And it took me a year to write these few pages. And I'm not saying it's a good book, but it's the best I could do. And one of the questions that I address, of course, is the Garden of Eden. And why did God put in it the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? And then tell Adam and Eve, you may not eat from it. Because if you do, you'll die. And then, when they did eat of it, they didn't die. He said, on the day that you eat of it, you will die. They didn't. So it's all very paradoxical. And why is it the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, not the tree of good and evil? And my understanding, which is a very inadequate one, but it's the best I could do, is that obviously the knowledge of good and evil comes before good and evil. Because good and evil are not inherent in things, they're the result of choices we make. I mean, this clipboard is neither good nor evil. If I bash you over the head with it, then I'm using for evil purposes. Stupid example. So the knowledge of it comes before, and because it comes before the good and evil itself, it can lead to anything only if there's free will. So that's what the tree is all about. You're given the choice between good and evil. Now, it seems to me also absolutely fundamental that good and evil are kind of joined at the hip. And you simply cannot have one without the other. Each is the negation of the other. And so when you say, why do we have evil? I could respond by saying, why do we have good? And then the question is, well, why did God put that tree there? And why just sidestep the whole issue? You could have a world without either of those. You could have a world without the tree, without the knowledge, without the actual thing. And I think the answer for that is also in the narrative there, when after Adam and Eve have eaten of the tree, of the fruit of the tree, God makes this remarkable remark. He said, now they have become like us, like God. God is plural. Now they've become like us, knowing good and evil. And I think that it was God's decision, for whatever reason, when he's not accountable to us, that he wanted the human being in some important ways to resemble God. And that the most significant way in which they could resemble God was by having the knowledge of good and evil. And if they were going to resemble God by having the knowledge of good and evil, they couldn't resemble him by having only the knowledge of good. Because then there wouldn't be, good can't exist without evil. So you want the human being to become like God? Well, then you have to have the knowledge of good and evil, of both. And that's why we have evil. I don't know if that's answering your question. That's my half-baked understanding of it.
I wanted a couple more questions, and feel free also to other thoughts that you have that we haven't come across now that you want to say. I wanted to ask, you mentioned earlier when you were in boarding school in India, you had this sense of not being able to say where you were from. So I'm wondering, where you think of as home now, or do you not think that's sort of a relevant concept?
On my doorpost, actually I use it in my email as well, I have a little quote from Ovid. What's her name? Arethusa. Arethusa is being chased by some kind of rapist. So she runs away and she arrives in Sicily. And she says, I've come to Sicily basically as a refugee. I live here as a stranger. But there is no place on earth that is dearer to me. Here I have a home. Here I have a place. I love those lines. So that's my answer to your question.
One thing I think, again, you've mentioned, I should have asked.
Oh, sorry, could I interrupt?
Yeah.
That's quite literally here. My home is my castle kind of thing. America, I really love America. I really admire America. I don't like and love or admire Europe or Asia. I still think of America as exceptional. I know that's old-fashioned, but that's what I think of. I think this is the most amazing country and a wonderful country. And I feel really fortunate that I have a place here.
Can you tell us a little about your family that you've had in the States?
My children, family.
Spouses, children,
Yeah.
grandchildren?
I have 3 children. My oldest daughter, Sarah, has severed her ties with the family, and none of us knows why. And frankly, at this point, I don't think any of us really cares, because she's not a nice person. She has 2 children who are lovely children, but I never get to see them anymore. And the joke is she's a family court judge in Phoenix. She's very bright. She went to Wellesley, trained as a lawyer, but she's not a nice person, and she doesn't want to have anything to say. So my next child is Abigail, who is a wonderful person. She's very, very creative, very, very inventive, a bit timid, but she's just full of ideas and full of energy. Although she has her doctorate in classical rhetoric. She likes to work in high tech. So that, for instance, the phone I use is one that she was the team that led the team that designed that phone. And now she works in a company in Salt Lake City, which develops programs for tracking footprints in places like airports, railway stations, department stores. I mean, who'd have thought of it? But apparently it's really a very valuable business. So that, but she that's the kind of thing that she does. Her husband is a kind of sociologist, but he's basically interested in the sociology of cancer. So he has a joint appointment at the University of Utah and in the big cancer hospital in Salt Lake, Huntsman. He's a very, very bright guy. My son Adam is, yeah, he's 40 now. He's a musician. And when I was living in Arizona, he went to the music school at ASU, but then he dropped out because he couldn't take the competition from all these young Korean girls who'd been playing the violin since they were 4 and so on. So then he went off to Nashville and trained as a sound technician. But then he started a band with 2 friends, and he wrote songs for the band, which were all for small children. And the band was called Adam and the Couch Potatoes. And this thing became incredibly popular. For instance, the mayor of Nashville has this big bash for kindergarten kids, the new school year. And Adam and the Couch Potatoes were always the performers at this bash. Anyway, at a certain point, Adam decided he had enough. So he decided to go to whatever that, the university there is in Nashville, Vanderbilt. And he went for the interview, and that very day on the desk of the woman interviewing was a local newspaper. And the top half of the newspaper had Adam's photograph on it as a man to watch out for, you know, great musical future and so on. So on that strength of that, he was given like a free ride through Vanderbilt. Then he decided he wanted to go to Stanford to study design. So I said, Adam, you know, you got a C+ average at Vanderbilt. Yeah, well, if they don't want me to. Anyway, he got in with a free ride. I don't know how he does it. And then he met his wife and a friend, and they started a company which is extraordinary. They work right now, they're in Detroit, they work with Michigan, state of Michigan, and they take application forms for various services. Let's say you need a subsidy for heating your house. It used to be something like a 30-page application form, which meant that most people didn't bother to fill it, you know, because it implied a level of literacy and so on that they didn't have. So working with the bureaucracy, Adam and his group whittled this down to 2 pages, which was totally accepted by the bureaucracy, which I find surprising, because it must have made a lot of them, you know, they weren't needed anymore. But that's what they do. They take these application forms, and they make them viable for people who are not very educated. And they've done well. Recently, they got a $5 million grant from Bill Gates, you know, that kind of thing. So, and they have one son, Nathan, whom I'm wild about. Beautiful little child. Anyway, so that's, and then I have this trail of ex-wives. We don't need to get into that.
Let's take a quick technical break and we'll do some concluding things.
Okay. Because it's just a few things I'd like to add, if I may.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, you know, I'm now 83. And however long I live, it won't be very long. Because that's what being 83 means. And I'm not in the least bit afraid of dying. My one anxiety about dying is my dog. I don't want her to be alone, so I've arranged with my children and so on that they'll take my dog. I think one of the things one does when one's old is you kind of look back at all the things you wish you hadn't done and are ashamed of even, and at all the things you wish you had done but didn't do. And I think there are two ways of both of which can help you deal with that, so that when you do die, you've kind of made your peace with yourself and with your world and with your creator. And I think the first is not just to acknowledge these things that you shouldn't have done or that you should have done, not only to acknowledge them, but to forgive yourself. This is who you are, this is the life you led. And we're all flawed, and no matter what, you're always going to end up with shortcomings, with failings. And that's just part of the human destiny. So you should know that, but you should also forgive yourself for that. And the other part of that, I think, is it's a religious thing, and I'm not saying it should be for everyone, but for me, it's not only that you forgive yourself, but that you ask for forgiveness. And not necessarily to the people you've wronged, because they may not be allowed around or whatever. But if you believe in God, that you ask for God's forgiveness. And in the Jewish way of things, we use the word tshuva for forgiveness, for repentance, I suppose. And what tshuva really means is returning, from the root shuv, which means returning or gain. So the things you shouldn't have done and the things you did kind of weigh you down and separate yourself from the spark of divinity that's in you. And when you seek repentance, you are kind of rebuilding that connection. You're returning to that source, the divine source, if you will. I don't want to sound preachy. I'm just telling you that this is how I look at it. And forgiving myself is much easier than asking for forgiveness in that way. But it's a process. But as I look back on my life, I think I'm grateful for having been able to do all that large and often inconsequential range of things that I have done in my life. I've had a lot of experiences in my life. And I suppose I'm grateful that they have certain kind of entertainment value. And they also have a possibility of discovering things that you need to that I think you need to discover. They create, when you do this, I think, you create a certain kind of continuity in your life when you look back on it. It's no longer fragments, it's a continuous thing. And I think continuity brings, the experience of continuity, I think, brings understanding. And I think what you really want, one of the things you really want to do when you're my age is to recognize that continuity, because continuity brings understanding, in the sense that it shows you what the connection is between the seemingly disparate things. So continuity brings understanding, and that's I suppose what I want and what I've accomplished.
And what continuities have you found?
Jewish ones. I had a friend, I don't know if I mentioned this before, my only German friend ever, but he was profoundly anti-Nazi. And during the course of his long life, married, I think, 4 different Jewish women. And he would say of me that Michael's like an unguided missile. But an unguided missile ends somewhere, even if it's only kind of splashing down into the ocean. And it has its own continuity, even if its journey is irritating to some people or dispiriting to yourself. It has its continuity. I think that starting for me, certainly with the Eichmann trial, my continuity has been, I don't want to sound melodramatic, to realize how my tree is growing. My tree has grown a lot. The soil I've been lucky enough to have it grow in fertile soil. And I feel, very strongly connected to the Jewish past. I don't feel so strongly connected to the Jewish present. But trees grow in the past, they stand in the present. And my tree stands on the outskirts of a forest, so that where it stands isn't even all that rewarding. But it's the tree, the soil in which it grows. I'm very conscious of the fact that in what exists from me to Mount Sinai back in the day is what I find really rewarding, to the extent that I can get to know it. And so I'm also, very, very encouraged that I have children who are Jews, that I have grandchildren who are Jews, and that they will perhaps fertilize my tree when my tree is no longer growing. They will find fertile soil for their own trees. So I'm probably sounding a bit maudlin, but I suppose, do you know this marvelous line? And Gertrude Stein was dying. Do you know this? Alice B. Toklas, her lover, who was this very earnest, humorless person, went up to where she was lying and said, Gertrude, what is the answer? And Gertrude lifted over and said, what was the question? And she died, or so we're told. Well, I think my question was always, what am I as a Jew, and how real is what I think my Jewishness is? How real is it? How valid is it? And how many questions do I leave unanswered? And how many things am I too lazy, too timid, to whatever, to go into? I'm, for instance, either too lazy or too timid to have a real kosher diet. I just am. I just also feel it's not me, and that shouldn't be a relevant factor. But so, what am I as a Jew is certainly, there's not a clear answer, but there is something of answer, and the answer is ambiguous. But at least it is an answer. At least I do feel that my tree is in some soil, and that's more than I could say, for instance, for my parents, who lived their lives, as far as I know, devoid of anything Jewish. I think this is a huge treasure that we're given. This is how I feel. This is a huge obligation we are given, and that with that treasure and with that obligation, you really fulfill your historic destiny as well as your kind of personal inner destiny. But it's also a historic destiny, going back to Mount Sinai. So those are my half-baked ideas. I'm very grateful to you for doing this.
I have one last question I'd like to ask. For you, what significance is there, if any, about sharing your testimony today?
About sharing?
About sharing your testimony, giving us an interview today.
Well, remember, I'm a historian. Historians work from, if they're real historians, from source materials, from primary source materials, not from what professors write, but from the sources about which they write. And I've always felt that if you can give some, without being self-important at all, if you can add a little, few iotas to the sources that people down the road will use. I mean, imagine if we had this kind of thing, for instance, from the time of the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, or from the destruction of the Second Temple. I mean, how astonishing would that be? So that's a bit my feeling. There's also kind of an ego gratification because, you know, as you may have inferred, I like talking about myself. But there's also a feeling that I want my children to know me better than they do. That's very important to me. And my children are very loving, except for Sarah. But they're not particularly interested in my points of view, not particularly interested in my past. A few years ago, I went on this mind-shattering kind of pilgrimage to Auschwitz. And I asked my two children if they would come with me, and they said no. You know, so there are these bridges that they don't cross. And maybe this recording will function in that way, or not.
Thank you so much for giving us this interview. Let's take a short break and then we can come back and look at a few photographs, documents.
Ah, yes.
Okay.
How
many of those do you want? Is there a limit?
I mean, you know, we don't want to do 6 hours of photographs, but if you could, let's say, try and, this is a difficult exercise, of course, but perhaps 10 things.
Sure.
You know, there's been one or two things you've mentioned in the interview, possibly, pictures, old family photos of parents and, you know, family in India too. Okay. But somewhere around the 10 to 12.
Sure.
I'm cutting.
Yeah. And Mark is going to need to.
We're rolling.
This is a photograph of
Michael,
my.
Yeah, please tell us about this photo.
This is a photograph of my maternal grandparents, and it must have been taken in Germany. And as you can see, they are kind of an affluent, prosperous, very proper-looking couple.
And can you tell us their names?
Yes, my grandfather was called Moritz, M-O-R-I-T-Z, Moritz Neumann, and my grandmother was called Regina.
Thank you.
Okay. Photo 2.
These are my paternal grandparents with their 4 children. And it's a photograph, I assume, that was taken in Germany.
And roughly when would it have been taken?
Well, I would imagine probably around 1914, 1915, just judging from the age of the children. I'm impressed by the clothing the adults are wearing. It's not what you would expect a peddler and his wife to be dressed in, but it's possible that they rented the clothing for this photograph.
And can you name the people in the photograph?
Well, my grandmother was called Dvora. My grandfather was called Moshe. My father's older brother was called Joseph, Yup. His younger brother was called Yehuda, and his sister was called Shula.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm ready for this one.
And which one is it again?
Oh
yeah.
This looks like a
Yes. This are you ready to record?
Yes.
This is the press pass that was issued to me as a correspondent at the Eichmann trial. So that's a photograph of me at the age, I guess, of 21.
Thank you.
Okay. And I'm recording on Machine Men.
This is the only book that I had during my years in the prison camp. It's a book written for children. It's an anti-Nazi book that explains the rise of Nazism and its ultimate destruction. The illustrations in it are absolutely fabulous. I still find them just entrancing. The author was a friend of my parents. His name was Fritz von Drieberg. He was a German, a good German, and lived in New Delhi for much of his life.
Thank you.
This is a photograph of the Nawab of Hoti at a younger age than when I knew him. He's the one who showed me with so much effect his family tree.
And when would this photo have been taken, do you think?
I would imagine finding probably in the 1930s. He's in some kind of military uniform.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. These are two envelopes that had contained letters my father sent from the prison camp to his cousin Sam Wallach here in the United States. They show the various censorship stamps and so on.
And this was from when he was imprisoned in Dhaka, or what would
No, this was in I suppose Satara.
Oh, in India, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
This is the flyer of a debate at the Oxford Union in which I had to speak. The anti-Semitic theme of the debate was that the creation of Israel was the greatest mistake of the 20th century. You'll see my name as one of the speakers there.
And what do you remember of the debate itself and how it concluded?
I remembered it being completely predictable. The bad guys said what the bad guys always say, and the good guys respond. And I think I told you that afterwards I felt that we had made a tactical mistake. We shouldn't have responded. We should have totally changed the subject.
Do you feel the kind of narratives that you hear today in relation to Israel have changed since that time? Or are they
No, it's
largely
the same. It's been the same stuff for a couple of thousand years.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
This is an embroidered handkerchief that was given to me by one of the people I interviewed for my book on the liberation of Dachau. She was a nurse. She was picked up off the streets of Amsterdam and sent to Dachau for no apparent good reason, arbitrarily, in other words. The handkerchief is embroidered with the names of fellow prisoners and with the names of American Army soldiers and American Army nurses who liberated the camp. The handkerchief is not all that unusual. There are a number of them in the Holocaust Museum, I believe. But what is particularly important about this one is that in the top left-hand corner, with the crossed American and Dutch flags, it actually records not only the date, but the time of the day when the Americans first arrived into the camp. And that, as far as I know, is the only record, because American Army documents don't have that, the only record of when exactly the camp was liberated.
Thank you. And Michael, thank you for this interview.